They found the pig trough first, rusted iron, stained with something that wasn't mud. Behind the barn, half buried in frozen earth, positioned where a person could be forced to kneel. The town of Millbrook Creek had walked past it for years, had heard the screams they told themselves were wind, had seen the girl with hollow eyes, and said nothing. Because Agnes Hale was a pillar of the community. Because respectability is a powerful disguise. Because some cages are built with everyone watching and no one willing to see. This is the story of how silence became survival and how one voice shattered everything. If you're watching from your city, drop a comment below. I want to see how far Mara's story travels. And if this grips you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe how this ends. The morning Mara Hale turned 19, she woke to the sound of her stepmother's footsteps on the stairs. Not the gentle climb of someone bringing birthday wishes. Not the casual ascent of a woman starting her day. These were the measured, deliberate steps of a warden approaching a cell. Each footfall a promise, a reminder, a threat wrapped in the creaking wood of the old farmhouse. Mara was already awake. She'd been awake since before dawn, lying perfectly still in the narrow bed beneath the attic eaves, counting her breaths the way she'd learned to count everything in this house. Breaths, heartbeats, the seconds between Agnes's questions and the correct answer, the inches of space that might mean safety or punishment depending on Agnes's mood, the weather, the alignment of invisible forces Mara had spent 6 years trying to predict and never could. The door opened without a knock. Doors in the Hale house didn't require knocking, not for Mara's room. Privacy was a privilege reserved for people, and Mara had learned long ago that in Agnes's eyes, she'd never quite qualified. "You're awake." Agnes stood in the doorway, backlit by the lamp from the hallway, her severe frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the small room whole. She was dressed already, her graying hair pulled into its customary tight bun, her high-collared dress buttoned to the throat despite the August heat that made the attic stifling. "Good. The chickens won't feed themselves, and Mrs. Patterson needs those eggs by 7. You're already behind." Mara sat up, careful to keep her movements smooth, non-threatening. "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am," Agnes repeated, her thin lips twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile. So obedient this morning, one might almost believe it. She stepped into the room, and Mara felt her spine straighten involuntarily, every muscle preparing for fight or flight, though she'd do neither. Fighting led to the cellar. Flight led to worse. "I counted the eggs yesterday," Agnes continued, her voice taking on that particular quality. Soft, almost conversational, the tone she used before the storm hit. 37. This morning, there were 36 in the cold box. Mara's mind raced. She'd been careful. She was always careful. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't insult me with excuses. You ate it, didn't you? Couldn't resist stealing food that isn't yours from a woman who's given you everything. The accusation was absurd. Mara hadn't eaten an egg in weeks. Agnes controlled every morsel of food that entered her mouth, measured out her portions with a pharmacist's precision. But absurdity didn't matter in this house. Truth didn't matter. Only Agnes's version of reality mattered, and in that version, Mara was always guilty. "I didn't," Mara started, then caught herself. Defending yourself was arguing. Arguing was disrespect. Disrespect was... Agnes's hand shot out, gripping Mara's chin with fingers that felt like iron clamps. "Look at me when I speak to you." Mara looked. She met Agnes's pale blue eyes and saw nothing there. No anger, no emotion at all. Just a cold, flat assessment, like a butcher examining livestock. "You have your father's eyes," Agnes said quietly. "James always was a liar too, made promises he never kept, left me with nothing but debts and a useless girl to feed." Her fingers tightened. "Do you know what nothing tastes like, Mara? Do you know what it's like to be owed something and never receive it?" Mara said nothing. There was no right answer to questions like these. Agnes released her suddenly, stepping back. "Get dressed. You have 15 minutes to complete the morning chores. If Mrs. Patterson doesn't have her eggs by 7, you'll spend tonight in the cellar contemplating the virtue of punctuality." She left without another word, her footsteps descending with the same measured cadence, leaving Mara alone in the suffocating heat of the attic, with the taste of fear sharp on her tongue. 15 minutes. Impossible, but that was the point. Mara dressed in the clothes laid out for her. They were always laid out, chosen by Agnes, another small way of erasing choice. The dress was too large, hanging on her thin frame like a sack. She'd lost weight again. Agnes claimed it was laziness, a refusal to eat the perfectly good meals provided. The truth was more complicated, hidden in the bitter tea Agnes made her drink each morning, in the way her hands trembled more each week, in the exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. But Mara had learned not to think about such things. Thinking led to questions. Questions led to hope. Hope was the cruelest torture of all. She descended the narrow attic stairs, moving through the house with the practiced silence of a ghost. The farmhouse was large, too large for two people, filled with the remnants of her father's life before Agnes. Photographs lined the hallway. James Hale smiling, robust, alive. In the later photos, taken after he'd married Agnes following Mara's mother's death, his smile looked strained, his eyes tired. In the final photo, taken 6 months before his own death from what the doctor called sudden heart failure, he looked like a man drowning. Mara didn't linger on the photos. She'd learned that Agnes watched for such things, interpreted every glance as rebellion or mourning or some other crime against the narrative she'd constructed. The kitchen was spotless, as always. Agnes ran the house with military precision, every surface gleaming, every item in its designated place. Mara's place was in motion, cleaning, cooking, serving, existing only in utility. Outside, the August morning was already brutal. The Oklahoma sun hung low and merciless, promising another day of scorching heat that would bake the red earth until it cracked. Millbrook Creek sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that demanded strength to survive it. The chicken coop sat behind the barn, a rickety structure that Mara had repaired dozens of times with whatever scraps she could find. The hens clucked irritably as she entered, disturbed from their roosts. She worked quickly, scattering feed, collecting eggs with gentle hands despite her haste. 37 eggs. She counted twice. Agnes had lied about the missing egg, of course. It was a test, a trap, a way to ensure Mara started the day already guilty, already owing penance. She was carrying the basket back to the house when she saw him, a stranger leading a horse down Main Street, visible from the farmhouse fence line. Even from a distance, there was something different about him, the way he moved, unhurried despite the heat, comfortable in his own skin. Most people in Millbrook Creek moved with the unconscious tension of those aware they were always being watched, always being judged by the collective eyes of a small town. This man walked like someone who'd learned to carry his own judgments and didn't need anyone else's. Mara watched for only a moment before catching herself. Agnes could be at any window. Agnes was always at some window. She hurried inside, set the eggs in their designated spot in the cold box, and began preparing Agnes's breakfast. Oatmeal, precisely measured. Tea, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. Toast, cut diagonally because horizontal cuts were common. Agnes descended at 7 o'clock exactly, settling at the table without acknowledgement. Mara served in silence, then retreated to the corner of the kitchen to await further instructions. "The church social is Saturday," Agnes said, not looking up from her oatmeal. "Reverend Mitchell expects our best showing. You'll need to prepare 3 pies, apple, cherry, and pecan. Mrs. Winters will provide the fruit. You'll collect it from her this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am." "And you'll need a proper dress. The one you wore last month was embarrassing, threadbare, and ill-fitting. People talk, Mara. They see a girl who can't even dress herself respectably, and they wonder what kind of household this is." The irony would have been laughable if Mara had any laughter left. Agnes controlled her wardrobe, allowed her nothing new, criticized the results of her own restrictions. It was a perfect closed loop of blame. "I'll do better, ma'am." "See that you do." Agnes finished her breakfast, dabbed her lips with the napkin, and stood. "I have errands in town. You'll clean the house top to bottom. I expect to see my reflection in the floorboards when I return." "And Mara?" She paused at the doorway. "Don't even think about being lazy. I'll know." Then she was gone, and Mara was alone. Alone. The word should have meant relief, freedom, a chance to breathe. Instead, it meant hypervigilance. Agnes had ways of knowing things, or claiming to. She'd return with accusations of tasks undone, of rest taken, of tiny infractions against rules that shifted like sand. Whether she actually knew or simply guessed didn't matter. The consequences were real either way. Mara cleaned. She started in the parlor, dusting every surface, beating the rugs until her arms ached, scrubbing the windows until the glass vanished and only the view remained. She moved through each room methodically, erasing every trace of existence, making the house perfect and empty and dead. By noon, she was lightheaded. Agnes had given her no breakfast, punishment for the imaginary stolen egg, and lunch wouldn't come until Agnes returned and decided she'd earned it. The bitter morning tea sat heavy in her stomach, making her queasy. She'd learned to tolerate the taste, but lately it made her hands shake worse, made the fatigue cling to her bones like frost. She was on her knees scrubbing the kitchen floor when she heard the knock at the door. Mara froze. No one knocked at the Hale house. Agnes's friends simply entered, announcing themselves with comfortable familiarity. Tradesmen came to the back. The postman left mail in the box by the road. The knock came again, firm but polite. Slowly, Mara stood. Her dress was soaked with sweat and dirty water. Her hair had escaped its braid, hanging in damp strands around her face. She looked exactly like what she was, a servant, a ghost, a girl erased. She opened the door and found the stranger. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought, maybe 25, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin. He wore dusty travel clothes and had the lean, weathered look of someone who spent more time under open sky than under roofs. "Afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for Mrs. Agnes Hale. She home?" His voice was wrong. Not wrong exactly, but different. There was no edge to it, no undercurrent of judgment or expectation. He spoke to Mara like she was a person who might have useful information, not a problem to be solved or an inconvenience to be managed. "She's in town," Mara heard herself say. "Should return within the hour." "Ah," he smiled slightly. "I'm Ethan Cole. I'm delivering some paperwork from the Territorial Land Office in Denver. Been carrying it for weeks, finally made it here." He shifted the leather satchel on his shoulder. "Would it be all right if I waited? It's quite a ride back." Every instinct screamed at Mara to say no, to close the door, to not risk whatever Agnes would make of a strange man waiting at the house. But the land office was official business, the kind Agnes valued. Refusing might be worse than allowing. "There's a bench on the porch," Mara said carefully. "You're welcome to wait there. I can bring you water." "That's kind of you, miss." "Mara." The name escaped before she could stop it. Agnes preferred she not introduce herself. "Let me handle the social niceties, you just stay quiet." But it was too late now. "Miss Mara." He tipped his hat again and moved to the porch bench. Mara closed the door, her heart hammering. She'd spoken too much, offered too much. Agnes would know somehow, would see the water glass and ask questions and find guilt in whatever answers Mara provided. But she'd offered, and breaking a promise felt worse than risking Agnes's anger. She filled a glass from the pump, her hand shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim. When she brought it outside, Ethan Cole was sitting with his hat in his lap, looking out over the property with an expression she couldn't read. "Thank you," he said, accepting the glass. He drank deeply, then paused, looking at her with those two blue eyes. "Are you all right?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely asked, that Mara felt something crack inside her chest. "I'm fine," she said automatically. The words came from years of practice, smooth as river stones. But Ethan Cole was still looking at her, and she realized what he was seeing. The too large dress hanging on a frame that was too thin, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she held herself perfectly still like a rabbit sensing a predator. "You sure about that?" he asked quietly. And Mara felt fear spike through her veins because this was dangerous, this noticing, this caring. In 6 years, the entire town had perfected the art of not seeing. This stranger had been on her porch for 5 minutes, and he'd already seen too much. "I should get back to my work," she said, retreating before he could ask anything else. She spent the next 40 minutes in the kitchen, scrubbing the same section of floor over and over, listening for the sound of Agnes's wagon. When it finally came, she felt relief and dread in equal measure. Agnes entered through the front, and Mara heard voices. Agnes's measured tones, Ethan's polite responses. Then silence, presumably while Agnes read whatever documents he'd brought. More conversation, too low for Mara to make out words. Finally, the front door closing, hoofbeats fading down the road. "Mara!" Agnes's voice rang through the house. Mara appeared in the parlor doorway, eyes down, hands clasped. Agnes was standing by the window, watching Ethan Cole ride away. "You gave that man water." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. He'd ridden far. It seemed—" Seemed? Agnes turned and her face was calm, which was somehow worse than anger. "You thought. You decided. You acted without my permission, inviting a strange man onto my property, making yourself familiar with him." "I thought it was appropriate, ma'am. He had official business." "You don't think." The calm shattered. "You don't decide what's appropriate. You're a stupid girl with ideas above her station, and every time I give you the slightest freedom, you abuse it." Mara said nothing. Words only made it worse. Agnes crossed the room in 3 strides, gripping Mara's arm hard enough to bruise. "Did you speak to him? Did you complain? Did you try to make me look bad?" "No, ma'am. I only gave him water and told him you'd return soon." "Liar." Agnes's face was inches from hers now. "I saw how he looked at you when he left. Concerned, suspicious." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing, ma'am. I swear I said nothing except—" The slap came fast, snapping Mara's head to the side. Her ear rang, bright pain blooming across her cheek. "Don't you dare take that tone with me," Agnes hissed, "swearing like some common criminal. Your father would be ashamed." Mara tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. She kept her eyes down, kept breathing, kept existing in that small, safe space inside herself where Agnes couldn't quite reach. "The cellar," Agnes said, releasing her. "Until morning. Perhaps some time in the dark will teach you about appropriate behavior." The cellar. Mara's stomach dropped, but she didn't protest. Protesting made it longer. Agnes marched her through the kitchen, down the narrow stairs to the cellar, a packed earth room that smelled of damp and rot, and the particular flavor of fear that had seeped into its walls over 6 years. There was no light, no window, nothing but darkness and the scurrying sounds of whatever lived in the corners. "Maybe this time you'll learn," Agnes said, and closed the door. The lock clicked. Footsteps retreated. Silence fell like a weight. Mara stood in the absolute dark, counting her breaths, counting her heartbeats, counting the seconds until she could count hours instead. This was survival. This was her life. This was all there was and all there would ever be. She'd almost convinced herself of that when she heard it, a sound so faint she might have imagined it. Hoofbeats, distant, then stopping. The creak of the porch. A knock at the door. Ethan Cole's voice, muffled but clear. "Mrs. Hale? Sorry to bother you again, but I forgot to get your signature on one of the forms." Agnes's voice, sugary sweet. "Of course, Mr. Cole, do come in." And Mara stood in the dark cellar, listening to the man who'd noticed speak to the woman who'd made noticing a crime, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous, but something close to it. Something that whispered, "Someone saw." In Millbrook Creek, that was revolution enough. The night in the cellar lasted 13 hours. Mara knew because she counted every minute, tracked time by the shift of air currents through the tiny gap under the door, by the distant sounds of the house above settling into sleep. Agnes had left her without food, without water, without even a blanket against the chill that crept into the earth-walled room as night deepened. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. The cellar was Agnes's favorite punishment, isolated, terrifying, and completely deniable. "She's prone to dramatics," Agnes would say if anyone asked, which they never did. Sometimes she locks herself away, claims she's being mistreated. Teenage girls can be so theatrical. But this time felt different. This time Mara couldn't stop replaying those 5 minutes on the porch. The way Ethan Cole had looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. The way he'd asked if she was all right, as if her well-being mattered, as if she were more than furniture in Agnes's carefully curated house. It was dangerous to remember such things, dangerous to feel the crack widen in the armor she'd built around hope. When Agnes finally opened the door the next morning, Mara was sitting against the far wall, awake, her arms wrapped around her knees. The light from the kitchen stabbed into the darkness, making her eyes water. "Come upstairs," Agnes said flatly. "Clean yourself. You look like something dragged from a ditch." Mara climbed the stairs on shaking legs, muscles cramped from cold and stillness. Agnes stood aside, watching with clinical detachment as Mara passed. "I hope you've learned something," Agnes said, "about discretion, about knowing your place." "Yes, ma'am." "Good, because Mr. Cole will be returning this afternoon. He's arranged to board at the Patterson house for a week while he conducts business in the area. I won't have you embarrassing me further." Mara's heart stuttered. A week. The stranger who'd noticed would be in town for a week. "You'll stay out of sight when he visits," Agnes continued. "You'll speak only if directly addressed, and then only to answer questions. You will not volunteer information. You will not make yourself conspicuous. Am I clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Mara?" Agnes stepped closer, her voice dropping to that soft, dangerous register. "If I hear one word of complaint from anyone in this town about my treatment of you, if anyone expresses concern or asks questions, you'll discover that the cellar can be much less comfortable than what you experienced last night. There are chains down there. They haven't been used in years, but they still work. Do you understand?" Mara understood. She always understood. Understanding was survival. "Yes, ma'am." Agnes smiled then, the expression not reaching her eyes. "Excellent. Now go clean yourself up. You smell like dirt and failure." The Patterson house sat on Main Street, a respectable two-story boarding house run by Martha Patterson, a widow who'd turned her grief into profit by renting rooms to the occasional travelers passing through Millbrook Creek. It was neat, well-maintained, and strategically positioned directly across from the general store and the church, the twin hearts of town's social life. Ethan Cole settled into his room that afternoon, paid his week's rent in advance, and spent the remainder of the day walking the town's dusty streets with the kind of attention most visitors didn't bother with. Millbrook Creek was like dozens of other frontier towns scattered across Oklahoma territory. One main street, a handful of side roads, buildings that leaned slightly as if tired of fighting the wind. There was a general store, a church, a blacksmith, a saloon that pretended to be a social club to maintain respectability, and a scattering of houses ranging from modest to aspirational. The people matched the town, hardworking, guarded, bound together by the complex web of small-town relationships where everyone knew everyone's business and pretended they didn't. They watched Ethan with the casual suspicion reserved for strangers, nodded politely when he tipped his hat, and shared nothing of substance. But Ethan had learned to read silences. He'd spent years working as a cattle driver, a surveyor's assistant, a dozen other jobs that required him to enter strange places and earn trust quickly. He knew how to listen to what wasn't being said. And Millbrook Creek was silent about something. That evening, he ate dinner at the boarding house. Martha Patterson proved to be an excellent cook and an even better source of information, though she delivered it in the carefully neutral tones of someone aware that words traveled fast in small towns. "You met Mrs. Hale, I understand," Martha said, serving him a second helping of pot roast. She was a woman in her 50s, comfortably round, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Briefly," Ethan confirmed. "Delivered some paperwork about land rights. Seems she owns quite a bit of property." "Oh yes, her late husband James was quite successful. Tragic, his death. So sudden." Martha's tone was perfectly modulated, sympathetic but distant, the way people spoke of tragedies they'd witnessed but not experienced. "And she has a daughter?" "Stepdaughter," Martha corrected. "Mara. James's daughter from his first marriage. Poor thing lost her mother young, then her father just a few years later. Lucky Agnes took her in, really. Not every woman would raise another woman's child." The words were right, but something in Martha's delivery felt rehearsed, like lines learned for a play everyone in town performed. "She seemed unwell," Ethan said carefully. "The girl, Mara." Martha's hand stilled for just a moment over the serving dish. "Unwell. Thin. Tired. Nervous." "Oh, Mara's always been delicate," Prone to melancholy, Agnes says. Takes after her mother in that respect. James's first wife was quite frail, died young of consumption. Martha resumed serving, her movements brisk. Agnes does her best, but some people are determined to be unhappy no matter how well they're treated. It was a neat narrative, delivered with practiced ease. Ethan recognized it for what it was, the official story, the version everyone agreed to believe because the alternative was too uncomfortable. He'd heard such stories before, in other towns, about other people. The drunk who just couldn't stop. The woman with bruises who walked into a door again. The child who fell down the stairs with suspicious regularity. Communities were remarkably creative when it came to explaining away what they didn't want to see. I'm sure you're right, Ethan said mildly, accepting the story the way travelers learn to accept local customs. But he filed the information away, along with the too quick defense, the slight tension in Martha's shoulders, the way her eyes didn't quite meet his when she spoke about Mara. After dinner, he walked to the saloon, the Millbrook Social Club, according to the carefully painted sign, though everyone called it Red's after the owner. It was early evening, the place half full of men nursing beers and trading the day's gossip. Ethan ordered a whiskey and listened. Patterson's charging too much for rooms again. Cattle prices down, might not make costs this year. Mitchell's Sunday sermon went 20 minutes long, thought my back would break. Normal conversation, the rhythm of small-town life. Then, saw Hale's girl at the store yesterday, getting thinner, Agnes working her too hard. Not our business, Tom. Just saying, girl looks half-starved. Agnes takes good care of her. Mara's just naturally thin, takes after her mother. The same defense, slightly different words. Ethan glanced over and saw two older men, both weathered by years of farm work, both looking uncomfortable with the conversation. Still, the first man, Tom, persisted. Doesn't seem right, her being so thin when Agnes serves that big spread at church socials. Drop it, Tom. Agnes Hale is a respected woman in this town. Been good to the church, good to her neighbors. What goes on in her house is her business. Tom took a long drink of his beer, looking like a man who wanted to argue but knew he wouldn't win. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, you're right. Not our business. And that was that. The conversation moved on to safer topics, weather, crops, politics in distant Washington that barely touched their lives. Ethan finished his whiskey slowly, processing what he'd heard. It wasn't much, just fragments. But fragments could tell a story if you knew how to arrange them. A girl who was naturally thin but getting thinner. A stepmother who was respected but whose household was not our business. A community that noticed but looked away. That spoke concerns in whispers but never loud enough to require action. He'd seen this pattern before too. Small towns could be close-knit communities, or they could be conspiracies of silence, and sometimes they were both at once. 3 days passed. Ethan completed his official business, verifying land boundaries, updating territory records, meeting with the few landowners who had questions about recent surveys. It was dry work, bureaucratic and tedious, but it gave him reason to move through the town, to observe, to ask casual questions that seemed related to land and property, but revealed far more about people. He saw Mara twice in those 3 days, both times from a distance. The first time was at the general store. She was collecting a package for Agnes, moving through the aisles like someone trying not to take up space. She wore a dress that hung on her frame, her hair pulled back so severely it seemed to pull at her skull. When the shopkeeper spoke to her, she kept her eyes down, answered in monosyllables, and left as quickly as possible without appearing to hurry. The second time was at church on Sunday. Agnes arrived with Mara in tow, both dressed in their finest. Agnes looked every inch the respectable widow, neat, composed, radiating an aura of modest prosperity and Christian virtue. Mara looked like her shadow, present but insubstantial, there but not quite real. During the service, Ethan watched from 3 pews back. Agnes sang the hymns in a clear, strong voice. Mara mouthed the words silently. Agnes greeted neighbors warmly after the service. Mara stood beside her, silent unless directly addressed, and even then her responses were brief, rehearsed. "Such a good girl, isn't she?" an elderly woman said to Agnes, patting Mara's hand. "So quiet and well-mannered." I've tried to raise her properly, Agnes replied with false modesty, though it's been a challenge. She has her father's stubborn streak, but with patience and prayer, even the most difficult children can be shaped into something acceptable. The words were delivered with a smile, light and conversational, but Ethan saw Mara's fingers tighten on her Bible, saw the way she seemed to shrink slightly, making herself smaller. After church, there was a social on the lawn. The usual gathering of food and fellowship that Ethan had learned was central to frontier community life. Long tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes. Children ran shrieking between the adults. Men stood in clusters discussing weather and politics. Women traded recipes and gossip. Agnes had contributed 3 pies, displayed prominently on the dessert table. Mara made them, she told anyone who complimented them, her hand resting on Mara's shoulder in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. She's quite skilled in the kitchen when she applies herself. Mara said nothing, just stood beside Agnes like an obedient dog waiting for permission to move. Ethan found himself watching them, trying to understand the dynamic. From a distance, they looked like any other family, a widow and her late husband's daughter, making their way in the world together. Agnes played her role perfectly, the devoted guardian, proud but not boastful, concerned but not smothering. But there were cracks in the performance if you knew where to look. The way Mara never met anyone's eyes. The way she startled when someone approached from behind. The bruise on her wrist that she kept tugging her sleeve to cover. The way she didn't eat despite being surrounded by food, didn't speak despite being in a crowd of people who'd known her since childhood. Quite a spread, Ethan said, approaching the dessert table. Agnes was there, cutting slices of pie for the Reverend. We do our best, Agnes replied graciously. Community is important, especially out here. We must take care of each other. Your stepdaughter is very talented, Ethan said, nodding toward Mara, who stood a few feet away, still silent. These pies are excellent. Agnes's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, she has her uses, though talent means little without character, don't you think, Mr. Cole? I think talent and character often go hand in hand, ma'am. Perhaps. Agnes cut another slice with precise movements. Though in my experience, true character is revealed through obedience, humility, and respect for one's betters. Don't you agree, Mara? Mara's eyes flicked up, met Ethan's for a fraction of a second, then dropped. Yes, ma'am. There it was again. That flash of something in her expression. Not defiance exactly, but not complete submission either. Something that whispered that the girl Agnes had tried to erase wasn't entirely gone. Well, Ethan said, I imagine it takes strength to maintain such standards, both to teach them and to learn them. Agnes looked at him sharply, as if trying to decode whether he was complimenting or criticizing. Finally, she smiled. Strength indeed, Mr. Cole, more than most people realize. She excused herself then, drifting toward another cluster of churchgoers, leaving Mara standing alone by the table. Ethan waited a moment, then moved closer. Those pies really are excellent, he said quietly. Mara didn't look up. Thank you, sir. Did you get to eat any? A pause. Then, so softly he almost missed it. No, sir. Why not? Agnes, Mrs. Hale, says I need to watch my figure, that I'm getting heavy. Ethan looked at the girl before him, thin to the point of frail, her collarbones sharp beneath the fabric of her dress, her wrists like bird bones. You're not heavy, he said. Mara's hands clenched. I should go. Agnes will need help serving. She started to move away, but Ethan spoke again. Mara, if you ever need help, I don't. The words came fast, almost panicked. I don't need anything. Please, don't. She hurried away before he could respond, disappearing into the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to become invisible. Ethan stood there, holding a plate of pie he no longer wanted, watching Agnes and Mara move through the social like they were tethered by invisible wires. Agnes charming and gracious, Mara silent and diminished. And he realized something that made his stomach tight with anger. The whole town knew. Maybe they didn't know the details. Maybe they didn't want to know the details, but they knew something was wrong. They saw the thinness, the fear, the bruises. They heard the silence. And they did nothing. Because Agnes was respectable. because she donated to the church and hosted socials and played her role perfectly, because intervening would be uncomfortable, would disrupt the social order, would require them to acknowledge ugly truths about someone they'd decided to respect. It was easier to look away, to tell themselves that it wasn't their business, that Mara was naturally thin or difficult, or whatever other excuse made the cognitive dissonance bearable. Ethan had seen this before, but it never got easier to witness. The casual cruelty of good people who chose comfort over conscience. He finished his pie. It was excellent, made with care by a girl who'd been denied even a single bite, and made a decision. He couldn't stay uninvolved. He'd tried that before, in other places, with other people suffering in plain sight while communities looked away. He told himself it wasn't his business, wasn't his responsibility, wasn't his fight. He'd regretted it every time. Maybe he couldn't fix everything. Maybe he couldn't save everyone. But he could try. For this one girl in this one town, he could at least try to be someone who didn't look away, even if he didn't yet know how. The opportunity came 2 days later, in a way Ethan didn't expect. He was at the Territorial Land Office, a small building that doubled as the town clerk's office in general record keeping, reviewing survey maps when he stumbled across something interesting. The Hale property records. They were public documents accessible to anyone who bothered to look. Most people didn't bother, but Ethan's work required him to cross-reference land ownership regularly, and what he found made him pause. The Hale property, all 160 acres of it, plus the farmhouse and outbuildings, wasn't registered to Agnes Hale. It was registered to Mara Hale. More specifically, it was registered to Mara Elizabeth Hale, sole heir of James William Hale, to be held in trust until the age of 21 or marriage, whichever comes first, at which point full ownership and control shall transfer to said heir. The trust was administered by Agnes as legal guardian, but she wasn't the owner. She never had been. Ethan read the document 3 times, making sure he understood it correctly. Then he checked the date. The trust had been established by James Hale 2 weeks before his death, properly witnessed and filed, which meant that everything Agnes had, the house, the land, the income from leasing portions of it to neighboring farmers, belonged legally to Mara. Agnes was just the temporary caretaker, managing assets she didn't own for a girl she treated like property. Did Mara know? Ethan doubted it. If she knew she was the actual owner, if she knew that at age 21 she could claim everything, but that was still 2 years away. 2 more years in that house under Agnes's control. Unless something changed. Ethan copied down the relevant information, thanked the clerk, and stepped out into the afternoon heat with his mind racing. This changed things. This gave Mara leverage she didn't know she had. But how to use it? If he went to her directly, Agnes would know. If he went to Agnes, she'd find a way to neutralize the threat. She'd been controlling this narrative for 6 years. She'd be expert at protecting it. He needed someone in the town who might help, someone who'd seen what he'd seen and felt the same discomfort he felt. He remembered the conversation in the saloon. Saw Hale's girl at the store yesterday, getting thinner. Tom, the man who'd spoken up, however briefly, before being silenced by social pressure. It took Ethan an hour to locate him. Tom Calder, it turned out, who lived with his wife Ruth on a small farm at the edge of town. Tom was in his 60s, weathered and lean, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent his life in the sun. "Mr. Calder, I'm Ethan Cole. Could I have a moment of your time?" Tom looked up from the fence he was mending, suspicious but polite. "About what?" "About Mara Hale." The suspicion deepened. "That's Hale business, not mine." "What if I told you it might be your business after all? That there might be something you could do?" Tom set down his tools slowly. "Why would you care? You're just passing through." "Maybe I care because I've passed through too many towns where people saw wrong happening and convinced themselves it wasn't their problem." Ethan met Tom's eyes steadily. "Maybe I care because that girl deserves better than what she's getting, and maybe you care too, or you wouldn't have said anything at the saloon last week." Tom's jaw worked. "You were listening?" "I was. And I think you see what I see, what a lot of people see but won't name. Agnes Hale is abusing her stepdaughter," Ethan finished flatly. "We both know it. The question is whether we're going to keep pretending we don't." For a long moment, Tom said nothing. Then he sighed, the sound heavy with years of weight. Come inside. You can say your piece to Ruth. She's the one who's been losing sleep over it. Inside the modest farmhouse, Ruth Calder proved to be a thin, nervous woman with kind eyes and hands that wouldn't stay still. When Tom explained why Ethan was there, she went very pale. I've wanted to say something, she whispered, for years. But no one would listen. Agnes is too respected, Ethan supplied. Too connected. Too good at looking proper. Yes. Ruth twisted her apron between her fingers. But I see Mara sometimes. At church. At the store. She's fading, Mr. Cole. Like a candle burning down to nothing, and we all just watch. What if you didn't have to just watch? Ethan pulled out the notes he'd made from the land records. What if Mara had power she didn't know about? What if there was a way to change the balance? He explained what he'd found. The trust, the true ownership, the fact that Mara was 2 years away from legal control over everything Agnes claimed as her own. Ruth's hand went to her mouth. She doesn't know. Agnes would never tell her. Exactly. But if she knew... Ethan trailed off, letting them understand the implications. Agnes would never let her reach 21 with that knowledge, Tom said grimly. She'd find a way to marry her off to someone she controls. Or worse. Or, Ruth said slowly, she'd do what she's already doing, just faster. Make her so weak, so sick, that she can't claim anything. Mr. Cole, have you seen Mara's hands shake? Have you noticed how tired she always is, even though she's young? Ethan had noticed. You think Agnes is making her sick deliberately? Ruth and Tom exchanged a look, the kind of look that came from years of marriage, whole conversations held in silence. I think, Ruth said carefully, that James Hale died very suddenly of heart failure. Young man, strong, no prior illness, dead within a week of sudden collapse. And I think Mara started getting sick not long after Agnes became her guardian. The implication hung in the air, ugly and terrible. You're saying Agnes poisoned her husband, Ethan said flatly. I'm saying James made that trust right before he died, Ruth replied. I'm saying he must have known something, suspected something, wanted to protect his daughter. I'm saying Agnes had motive to get rid of him and keep Mara too weak to ask questions or cause problems. Do you have proof? No, just suspicion, just watching, just knowing. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. And doing nothing, because who would believe me? Who would investigate Agnes Hale, pillar of the community, based on the suspicions of a farm wife? I believe you, Ethan said, and I think you're right, which means Mara is in more danger than we thought. Tom stood abruptly, pacing. So what do we do? Go to the sheriff? He's in Agnes's pocket. The reverend? He thinks she walks on water. Who in this town would stand against her? Maybe no one in this town, Ethan said. But there are people outside this town. Territorial marshals, federal authorities, people who don't have a stake in maintaining Millbrook Creek's social order. And you think they'd come? Based on what evidence? It was a fair question. Ethan didn't have an answer yet. Let me think on it, he said. But in the meantime, can you watch? Can you document what you see, the signs of illness, the bruises, anything that seems wrong? We can try, Ruth said, though Agnes is careful, very careful. Careful isn't the same as perfect. Everyone makes mistakes eventually. Ethan stood. Thank you for caring, for being willing to see. We should have done more, Tom said roughly. Years ago, we should have done more. You're doing more now. That counts for something. But as Ethan walked back to the boarding house, he wondered if it counted for enough. If anything could count for enough to save a girl who'd been drowning in plain sight for 6 years while an entire town looked away. He had 4 days left in Millbrook Creek, 4 days to figure out how to crack open a cage that had been carefully constructed, legally protected, and socially enforced for longer than Mara probably remembered being free. 4 days to be the kind of man who didn't just pass through and leave the broken things behind. He'd failed at that before. He wouldn't fail again. Not this time. Not this girl. Not while he still had breath to fight. The morning after his conversation with the Calders, Ethan woke to find a note slipped under his door at the boarding house. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste or fear. Mr. Cole, come to our farm today at noon. Ruth saw something. tea called. Ethan dressed quickly, his mind already racing through possibilities. He'd ask them to watch, to document. What had Ruth seen in less than 24 hours that warranted the risk of sending a note? He spent the morning finishing his official paperwork, maintaining the appearance of a man simply doing his job. At 11:30, he saddled his horse and rode out toward the Calder farm, taking a route that wouldn't draw attention from town. Tom was waiting by the barn when Ethan arrived, his weathered face creased with worry. "Ruth's inside," Tom said without preamble. "She's upset. What she saw, it shook her." They found Ruth in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. When she looked up at Ethan, her eyes were red-rimmed. "Tell him," Tom said gently, sitting beside his wife. Ruth took a shaky breath. "I went to the Hale house this morning. Agnes had asked me to drop off some preserves. We discussed it after church on Sunday. I thought it would be a good opportunity to check on Mara like you asked." "What did you see?" "Agnes was in town. I knew she would be. She mentioned at church she had errands, so it was just Mara at the house." Ruth's hands tightened on the cup. "She answered the door, and Mr. Cole, I could barely recognize her. In just the few days since Sunday, she's gotten worse. Thinner, paler. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the door." "Did you speak to her?" "I tried. I asked if she was feeling all right. She said she was fine, just tired. But her voice was so weak, and she kept swaying on her feet like she might faint." Ruth's voice cracked. "I asked if I could come in, maybe make her some tea. She looked terrified, said Agnes wouldn't like it, that she wasn't allowed visitors when Agnes wasn't home." Ethan felt anger coil in his gut. "What happened then?" "I pushed a little, told her I was worried about her, and she started crying, not sobbing, just tears running down her face like she couldn't stop them. She kept apologizing, saying she was fine, that I should go before Agnes came back." Ruth wiped her own eyes. "But before I left, I saw something." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small vial, no bigger than her thumb. The glass was dark, the contents invisible. "What is it?" Ethan asked. "I don't know, but it was sitting on the kitchen table, and there was a cup beside it, the kind Agnes uses for tea. Mara saw me looking at it, and she went white. Tried to distract me, asked if I wanted to leave the preserves in the cold box, but I'd already seen it." Tom leaned forward. "Ruth has a sharp memory. She described the vial to me, and I recognized it. Old Patterson, Martha's late husband, he was the town's unofficial pharmacist before he died. Used to keep medicines in vials just like that. Dark glass to protect from light." "What kind of medicines?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "All kinds. But the dark glass was usually reserved for tinctures, concentrated medicines that needed careful dosing." Tom's expression was grim. "Or poisons that needed to be disguised." Ruth set the vial on the table. "When Mara went to the cold box, I took it. I know it was stealing, but I had to. If Agnes is giving her something, how did you explain the missing vial?" "I didn't. I left before Mara came back from the cold box. If Agnes asks about it, she'll blame Mara." Ruth's voice broke. "That poor girl will be punished for something I did, and she won't even know why." "C'est yes." It was a terrible calculus. Stealing evidence that might save Mara's life, but ensuring her immediate suffering. But Ethan understood the choice. Without proof, they had nothing. With proof, they might have a chance. "We need to find out what's in this," Ethan said, picking up the vial carefully. "Is there anyone in town who could analyze it?" Tom shook his head. "No one with those skills. You'd need to go to Oklahoma City maybe, find a real pharmacist or a doctor." "That's 3 days' ride, minimum 6 days round trip." Ethan turned the vial in his hands, watching the liquid inside shift. "And in the meantime, Agnes will know something is missing. She'll punish Mara, maybe accelerate whatever she's doing." "We could go to the sheriff," Ruth offered, though her tone suggested she knew how that would end. "Sheriff Morrison?" Tom snorted. "He owes Agnes money. Borrowed it to expand his office 2 years ago, still hasn't paid it back. He's not going to investigate his creditor based on a stolen vial and our suspicions." Ethan thought fast. 6 days was too long, but doing nothing guaranteed Mara's continued suffering. There had to be another option. What if we don't wait for analysis? He said slowly. What if we create pressure from another direction? Force Agnes into a position where she has to respond? How? Ruth asked. By making her aware that people are watching, that her control isn't absolute, that Mara has advocates. Ethan met their eyes. And by making sure Mara knows she has power, Agnes has hidden from her. Tom frowned. You mean tell her about the trust? About her ownership of the property? Not yet. Too risky if Agnes finds out. But we can start planting seeds. Let Mara know there are people who see what's happening, who care, who will help if she asks. Ethan pocketed the vial. And we can make Agnes nervous. Make her wonder what we know. That's dangerous, Ruth said. If Agnes feels threatened, she might hurt Mara worse. She's already hurting Mara. We have to assume she has been for years. Ethan's voice was hard. The question is whether we keep letting her do it in the shadows, or whether we drag it into the light where she can't hide. The Calders looked at each other, that silent conversation passing between them again. We're in, Tom said finally. Whatever you need, we're done looking away. Good. Then here's what we're going to do. Ethan laid out a plan that was part strategy, part improvisation. It wasn't perfect. It relied on assumptions about Agnes's psychology and Mara's resilience that might be wrong, but it was better than waiting, better than hoping, better than the 6 years of silence that had brought Mara to the edge of destruction. They would act carefully. They would act soon. And they would act together. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook Creek, Ethan felt something like hope. The afternoon sun was brutal as Ethan rode back toward town, the vial safely tucked in his saddlebag. His mind churned through the possibilities, the risks, the ways this could go wrong. But beneath the planning, there was a core of certainty. This had to be done. He was halfway to Main Street when he saw her. Mara was walking along the dusty road that led from the Hale property toward town, a basket over her arm. Even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion in her gait, the way she moved like someone fighting gravity with every step. Ethan slowed his horse, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. When she heard the hoofbeats, she moved to the side of the road, her head down, making herself small. Miss Mara, Ethan said, bringing his horse to a stop beside her. She looked up, and he saw what Ruth had described. The worsening pallor, the dark circles, the tremor in her hands as she gripped the basket. Up close, she looked like someone being slowly erased. Mr. Cole. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Are you heading to town? Yes, sir. Agnes needs supplies from the store. It's a long walk in this heat. Can I offer you a ride? Fear flashed across her face. I couldn't. If anyone saw... If Agnes heard... I'm just a stranger offering a neighbor a ride. Nothing improper about that. Ethan kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. And you look like you could use the rest. Mara hesitated, swaying slightly on her feet. Ethan could see the calculation in her eyes, weighing the risk of accepting against the very real possibility that she might not make it to town and back on foot. Just to the store, she said finally, and only if you're heading that way anyway. I am. Ethan dismounted and helped her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance. He could feel how thin she was, how fragile, bones sharp beneath the fabric of her dress. They rode in silence for a minute, then Ethan spoke quietly. Mrs. Calder came to see you this morning. Mara stiffened. Yes, sir. She's concerned about you. She shouldn't be. I'm fine. Are you? The question was gentle but direct. Because you don't look fine, Mara. You look like someone who's very sick. Her breath hitched. It's just the heat. I'm not good with heat. It's not the heat. We both know that. Silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. Please don't. Please don't ask questions. It only makes things harder. Harder than what? Harder than whatever's happening to you now? You don't understand. Agnes, she's careful. She's smart. Even if someone asked questions, even if someone cared enough to look, there's nothing to find. She makes sure of that. Mara's voice cracked. And the people who could help, the sheriff, the reverend, the town officials, they all respect her. They'd never believe a word against her. What if I told you there are people who do believe, who do see? It doesn't matter who sees. Agnes controls everything, the house, the money, my future. I have nothing. I am nothing. That's what she tells me, and she's right. Ethan felt rage flash through him at the defeated certainty in her voice. She's not right. Mara, listen to me. No. The word came out sharp, desperate. Please. If you care at all, stop talking. Stop asking. Stop noticing. You'll be gone in a few days, and I'll still be here. And anything you do now will just make Agnes angrier. I've survived this long by being invisible. Don't make me visible, please. They'd reached the edge of town. Ethan helped Mara down from the horse, watching as she swayed on her feet, caught herself, forced herself upright. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Cole, she said formally, her mask sliding back into place. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Millbrook Creek. She walked toward the general store without looking back, and Ethan stood there feeling helpless and furious in equal measure. She was right about one thing. He'd be gone in a few days. His work in Millbrook Creek was nearly done. He could ride away, file a report with territorial authorities, tell himself he'd done what he could, and let them handle it. He'd done exactly that before, in other towns, with other people suffering. Told himself it wasn't his responsibility, that the system would work, that someone else would step in. The system hadn't worked. No one had stepped in. And the people he'd left behind had continued suffering, or disappeared, or died in ways that were ruled accidents or natural causes, or tragic but unavoidable. Not this time. This time he'd stay until it was finished, until Mara was safe, or he'd exhausted every option trying to make her so. He tied his horse outside the saloon and went inside, heading straight for the bar. Whiskey, he told Red, the owner, and information. Red was a big man with shrewd eyes and the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that bartenders heard everything and revealed nothing. Information costs more than whiskey. I'll pay. Ethan slid a silver dollar across the bar. Tell me about James Hale's death. Red's expression didn't change, but his hand stilled on the glass he was wiping. Why? Because I'm curious about sudden heart failure in healthy men. You a doctor? No, just someone who notices patterns. Ethan met Red's eyes steadily. And the pattern I'm noticing is that James Hale died very conveniently, very suddenly, right after setting up a trust to protect his daughter from his new wife. Red poured the whiskey, his movements deliberate. Careful what you imply, stranger. Agnes Hale is well connected. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking what you remember about how James died. Red considered for a long moment, then leaned in, his voice dropping. I remember he came in here one night, about a week before he died. Sat right where you're sitting, ordered whiskey and didn't touch it. Just sat there looking like a man who'd seen his own grave. Did he say anything? Said he'd made a mistake. Said he'd thought Agnes was a good woman, a proper Christian woman who'd be a mother to Mara after his first wife died. Said he'd been wrong. Red's eyes were distant, remembering. Said he'd fixed it, though. Made sure Mara would be protected. Made sure she'd get what was hers when she came of age. The trust. I didn't know about that then. Didn't know until you mentioned it just now. Red wiped the bar with more force than necessary. But, yeah, makes sense. James was worried. Said Agnes had changed after the wedding, got controlling, started making Mara's life hard. He was planning to do something about it. And then he died. And then he died. Sudden collapse, dead before the doctor could even get to the farm. Doctor said it was heart failure. Happens sometimes, even to younger men. No one questioned it. Red met Ethan's eyes. Should they have? I think someone should question a lot of things in this town. Questioning and proving are different animals. Red straightened. But between you and me, I've wondered. For years I've wondered. James was healthy, strong, worked his farm every day without complaint. Then suddenly he's dead and Agnes is running everything, and that bright little girl who used to come to town with her father turned into a ghost. You noticed. I notice everything comes with the job. Red's jaw tightened. Noticing and doing something about it are also different animals. I got a business to run, a family to feed. Agnes could ruin me if she wanted to, and she would. She's got power in this town. power she stole from a dead man and the daughter she's destroying. Maybe, probably, but that doesn't change reality. Red refilled Ethan's glass without being asked. Look, I don't know what you're planning, but if you're going up against Agnes Hale, you better have more than suspicion and righteousness. She's smart, she's ruthless, and she's been building her position here for 6 years. You're one stranger with a few days left in town. Then maybe I need to make those days count. Red studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe you do. And maybe if someone finally stands up to her, others might find their courage too. But don't count on it. Fear is stronger than conscience in small towns. Ethan drank his whiskey, feeling the burn, thinking through the next steps. Red was right. He needed more than moral certainty. He needed evidence, leverage, allies, who would stand firm when Agnes pushed back. He had a vial that might contain poison. He had the Calders' testimony about what they'd seen. He had land records that proved Agnes wasn't the owner she pretended to be. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. Red, Ethan said. If I needed to get a message to territorial authorities without going through the sheriff or the local telegraph office, how would I do it? Red's eyebrows rose. Thinking big, aren't you? Thinking practical. I don't trust anyone in this town to deliver information Agnes wouldn't want delivered. Smart. Red considered. There's a mail coach that runs through here twice a week, stops at Patterson's boarding house. Martha routes it. If you gave her a sealed letter addressed to someone specific, she'd have to send it. Federal mail, tampering with it is a crime even Agnes can't make disappear. When's the next coach? Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Perfect. Ethan finished his drink and stood. Thanks for the information. Don't thank me yet. You might wish I'd kept my mouth shut when Agnes comes after you. But Red's expression suggested he hoped Ethan succeeded. Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon composing a letter to the territorial marshal's office in Oklahoma City. He laid out what he knew. The suspicious death of James Hale, the deteriorating condition of his daughter, the evidence of possible poisoning, the property ownership Agnes had concealed. He included the Calders' names as witnesses willing to testify. He didn't include speculation or emotion, just facts and questions that demanded official investigation. The kind of letter that couldn't be easily dismissed. He sealed it, addressed it, and delivered it to Martha Patterson just before dinner. Martha took the letter with shaking hands, reading the address. The territorial marshal? It's official business related to land disputes, Ethan said, the lie coming easily. Needs to be filed properly. Martha wasn't fooled. She looked at him with something between fear and hope. This is about Mara. This is about ensuring territorial laws are followed, Ethan said carefully. The mail coach leaves tomorrow. At 6, I'll make sure it's on board. Martha clutched the letter. Mr. Cole, if Agnes finds out, she won't. Not until it's too late. And if the marshal doesn't come, if they decide it's not worth investigating, then I'll find another way. Ethan's voice was hard with certainty. But I'm not leaving this town until Mara is safe. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. For caring. For being brave enough to do what the rest of us should have done years ago. Ethan wanted to say she was being too generous, that caring wasn't the same as effective action, that bravery was easier for strangers who could leave than for people whose entire lives were woven into this town's social fabric. But he just nodded and left, letting her believe in the possibility of justice, because one of them had to. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in his rented room at the boarding house, listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness, thinking about a girl locked in that farmhouse with a woman who viewed her as an obstacle to be slowly eliminated. The hardest part wasn't what Agnes had done. It was that she'd been able to do it openly, with the entire town watching, for 6 years. Every person who'd seen Mara getting thinner and said nothing, every neighbor who'd heard her cry and turned up their radio, every church member who'd seen the bruises and offered empty platitudes about God's plan. They'd all participated in Mara's destruction through their silence, their cowardice, their unwillingness to disrupt the comfortable fiction that respectable people didn't commit atrocities. Agnes was the hand holding the knife, but the town had held Mara still. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked. A wagon rolled past on the street below. Normal sounds of normal life continuing while a girl suffered a mile away. Ethan got out of bed and pulled the vial from his saddlebag, holding it up to the lamplight. The liquid inside was clear, innocuous looking. It could be medicine, it could be nothing, but he knew it wasn't nothing. Ruth's instincts had been right. Agnes was poisoning Mara, had probably been poisoning her for years, keeping her weak and compliant and too sick to fight back or ask questions. The dose would be careful, measured. Too much would kill quickly and raise questions. Too little would let Mara recover and regain strength. Agnes would have found the perfect balance, just enough to keep Mara dying slowly while maintaining the appearance of natural illness. It was brilliant in its cruelty. And it would have worked perfectly if no one had cared enough to look. Ethan rewrapped the vial carefully and tucked it away. Tomorrow, the letter would go out. In a week, maybe 2, the territorial marshal might arrive. But that was too long. Anything could happen in 2 weeks. He needed to apply pressure now. Make Agnes doubt her control. Create space for Mara to breathe. And he knew exactly how to do it. The next morning, Ethan attended the 6 o'clock mail coach departure. He watched Martha hand his sealed letter to the driver, watched it disappear into the mailbag, watched the coach roll away toward Oklahoma City, carrying the first crack in Agnes's carefully constructed world. Then he walked to the Hale property. It was early enough that the farmhouse was just waking up. Smoke rose from the chimney, Agnes making breakfast. The chickens were already fed, which meant Mara had been up before dawn as usual. Ethan knocked on the door with the confident authority of someone who had every right to be there. Agnes answered, surprise flickering across her face before she smoothed it into polite welcome. "Mr. Cole, this is unexpected." "Mrs. Hale, I apologize for the early call. I was reviewing the land records for my final report and noticed some inconsistencies. I wanted to clarify ownership details before I leave town." He saw her eyes narrow slightly. "Inconsistencies?" "Just technical matters. May I come in? It won't take long." Agnes hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course." The farmhouse interior was exactly as Ethan had imagined. Spotless, carefully arranged, sterile in its perfection. Nothing out of place, nothing personal. A house that was a stage set rather than a home. "Mara," Agnes called toward the kitchen. "Bring tea for our guest." Mara appeared in the doorway, and Ethan had to suppress his reaction. She looked worse than yesterday, if that was possible. Her skin had a gray cast, her eyes were sunken, and she moved like every step hurt. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Agnes said, gesturing to the formal parlor. "Now, what inconsistencies are you referring to?" Ethan pulled out his notebook, playing the part of bureaucratic functionary. "The property records show the land registered to Mara Hale, with you listed as trustee and guardian. I need to verify that arrangement is still current." He watched Agnes's face carefully. For just a moment, barely a second, something cold and dangerous flashed in her eyes. "The arrangement is unchanged," she said smoothly. "My late husband set up the trust. I manage the property until Mara comes of age." "At 21? "Yes." "And Mara is aware of these arrangements?" "Naturally. Though such matters are complicated for young girls, I handle all business affairs." It was a lie. Ethan could see it in the casual certainty with which Agnes delivered the words, could hear it in the dismissive tone she used about Mara's understanding. Mara returned with tea, her hands shaking so badly the cups rattled in their saucers. She set the tray down carefully, keeping her eyes averted. "Thank you, Mara," Ethan said. "Would you mind staying? I may have some questions about the property that you could help answer." "Mara knows nothing about business matters," Agnes said quickly. "She has no head for such things. Isn't that right, Mara?" "Yes, ma'am." The response was automatic, defeated. "Still," Ethan pressed gently, "as the registered owner, she should be present for discussions about her property. It's standard practice." He watched Agnes's jaw tighten. She was trapped between maintaining the fiction of Mara's ownership and keeping her ignorant of it. "Very well," Agnes said coldly. "Mara, sit." Mara perched on the edge of a chair like a bird ready to flee. Ethan pulled out the land survey maps, spreading them on the table between them. "These documents show the property boundaries and ownership," he said, angling them so both women could see. "Mrs. Hale, You manage the estate. But Miss Mara, as the legal owner, you should understand what you possess. He saw Mara's eyes widen slightly as she looked at the papers, saw the moment the words registered. Legal owner, your property. I don't understand business, Mara said softly, but her gaze was locked on the documents. It's quite simple, Ethan continued, ignoring Agnes's mounting tension. Your father left you 160 acres of prime farmland, this house, and all associated buildings. The annual income from leasing portions to neighboring farmers is approximately $800. That belongs to you. The silence that followed was electric. Mara stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language she was just beginning to translate. Agnes's face had gone white with barely suppressed rage. Mr. Cole, Agnes said, her voice dangerously soft. I appreciate your thoroughness, but as I said, Mara has no head for these matters. The trust is properly managed. There's no need to confuse her with details. I don't think Miss Mara is confused at all, Ethan said, meeting Agnes's eyes directly. I think she understands perfectly well that this is her property, her inheritance, her future. Don't you, Miss Mara? Mara's fingers trembled as they touched the edge of the survey map, tracing the boundary lines of property she'd never known belonged to her. Her voice came out barely audible, cracking on each word. This is mine? Yes, Ethan said firmly, before Agnes could intervene. Your father made certain of it. The trust ensures you inherit everything when you turn 21. Agnes stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a violence that made Mara flinch. That's quite enough, Mr. Cole. You've verified what you needed to verify. Mara has chores to attend to, and I have a busy day ahead. But Ethan didn't move. Actually, I have a few more questions. About the trust management. The annual accounting should be available for review, standard practice for estates of this size. I'll need to see those records before I file my final report. The color that had drained from Agnes's face returned in a flood of red. Those are private financial matters. They're public trust matters. Miss Mara has every right to see how her inheritance is being managed. Ethan kept his tone professional, bureaucratic, giving Agnes no opening to accuse him of impropriety. The territorial office requires documentation of all trusts involving minors. I'm sure you've kept meticulous records. Of course she hadn't. Ethan could see it in the way her hands clenched, in the muscle twitching at her jaw. Agnes had been treating Mara's inheritance as her own personal funds for 6 years, spending and controlling without oversight because no one had ever asked to see the books. I'll need time to gather those documents, Agnes said tightly. Of course. I'll return tomorrow at the same time. Ethan began rolling up the maps, but left one spread on the table in front of Mara. Miss Mara should familiarize herself with her property in the meantime. It's important for owners to understand what they possess. He met Mara's eyes, trying to communicate everything he couldn't say aloud. You have power. You have worth. You have options. But her expression was unreadable. Shock, fear, and something else he couldn't quite identify, flickering across her gaunt features. Tomorrow then, Agnes said, her voice like ice over stone. Mara, show Mr. Cole out. Mara stood unsteadily, leading Ethan toward the front door. As they reached it, she whispered without looking at him, You shouldn't have done that. Someone needed to. She'll make me pay for it. You don't know what she's like when she's angry. Then document it, Ethan said quietly, urgently. Every bruise, every punishment, every threat. Write it down. Hide it somewhere safe. When help comes, you'll need evidence. Help isn't coming. Help never comes. Help is already here, Mara. You just have to be brave enough to accept it. She opened the door, her eyes finally meeting his. What he saw there nearly broke him, a desperate, terrified hope fighting against 6 years of learned helplessness. I don't know how to be brave anymore, she whispered. She took that from me. Then borrow mine until you find your own again. Before Mara could respond, Agnes's voice cut through the house like a blade. Mara, now! Mara fled back inside without another word, and Ethan heard the door lock behind him with a finality that felt like a countdown starting. He'd just painted a target on Mara's back, and he knew it. But he'd also planted seeds Agnes couldn't fully uproot. Knowledge, awareness, the understanding that Mara owned what Agnes had been stealing. Those seeds would grow. and Agnes couldn't stop them without revealing her own crimes. The question was whether Mara would survive long enough for the harvest. Ethan rode back to town with his mind racing through contingencies. He'd pushed hard, maybe too hard, but gentle approaches had failed for 6 years. Sometimes you had to break the cage before you could free the bird, even if breaking it was dangerous. He was unsaddling his horse behind the boarding house when Ruth Calder appeared, her face pale with urgency. "Mr. Cole, thank goodness. I've been looking for you everywhere. What's wrong?" "Tom went to the Hale place this morning, just to drive past, check on things after you said you'd be visiting Agnes." Ruth wrung her hands. "He saw Agnes leave about an hour ago. She rode toward town in the wagon, moving fast. Tom said her face looked like thunder." Ethan's stomach dropped. "And Mara?" "Tom couldn't see her. The house looked empty, but—" Ruth's voice dropped. "Mr. Cole, there's something else." Agnes went straight to the sheriff's office. She was in there for 20 minutes, then she went to the church, spoke with Reverend Mitchell. Now she's at the general store, and I'm hearing she's been telling people you've been bothering her, making inappropriate advances, harassing Mara. The play was brilliant in its simplicity. Agnes was preemptively destroying Ethan's credibility, turning his advocacy into evidence of improper behavior. By the time word spread through town, no one would believe anything he said about her because he'd be the suspicious stranger with questionable motives. How many people has she told? By now? Probably everyone who matters. This town loves a scandal, Mr. Cole, and a strange man taking an unseemly interest in a young girl under the protection of a respected widow? Ruth shook her head. You'll be lucky if they don't run you out on a rail. Ethan forced himself to think past the anger. What about the Calders? Will you stand by what you've seen? Ruth's expression crumbled. Tom and we talked. And Mr. Cole, we want to help. We do. But Tom's got debts at the general store. If Agnes spreads word that we're making false accusations against her, the store could demand immediate payment. We'd lose our farm. The tears streaked her face. I'm so sorry. We're cowards, I know we are. But we have 3 grandchildren depending on us. And if we lose the farm... I understand, Ethan said. And he did. This was how Agnes maintained control. Not through violence alone, but through the web of economic and social dependencies that made defiance too costly for ordinary people to afford. Ruth grabbed his arm. But we haven't given up completely. Tom's been watching the Hale place from the road. If something happens to Mara, if Agnes does something obvious, we'll speak up then. We'll have to. We can't just... She couldn't finish, overcome by shame and helplessness. Keep watching, Ethan said. And Ruth? Hide that vial somewhere Agnes can never find it. It might be the only real evidence we have. After Ruth left, Ethan stood in the stable trying to reassemble his plan. The letter to the territorial marshal was already en route. Agnes couldn't stop that. But it would take time for any response. And in that time, she'd work to isolate him, discredit him, turn the town against him so thoroughly that when he made accusations, they'd sound like the ravings of a rejected suitor, or worse. He needed someone in authority who might listen, someone who wasn't in Agnes's pocket. The problem was identifying who that might be in a town where Agnes had spent 6 years cultivating influence. He was still thinking when Martha Patterson found him. Mr. Cole, a word? Martha's expression was grave. She led him to a storage room behind the boarding house, away from potential eavesdroppers. Agnes has been here, Martha said without preamble. Told me you've been making unwelcome advances toward her stepdaughter. Said you've been trying to turn the girl against her with lies about inheritance and property rights. And you believe her? I believe Agnes is a clever woman who knows how to tell convincing lies. Martha's eyes were hard. I also believe that letter you gave me yesterday had nothing to do with land disputes. I believe you're trying to help that poor girl, and Agnes knows it, and she's going to destroy you for it if you're not careful. Relief washed through Ethan. You'll still send the letter if another coach comes? It's already gone. Federal mail is sacred. I won't tamper with it no matter who asks. Martha paused. But Mr. Cole, you need to understand what you're up against. Agnes has been building her position here for years. She's generous to the church, helpful to her neighbors, always ready with a kind word or a charitable act. People like her. They want to believe the best of her. Even when a girl is dying under her roof? Especially then, because believing Agnes is good means they don't have to feel guilty about not helping Mara. It means they can sleep at night. Martha's voice turned bitter. This town is full of good people who've convinced themselves that looking away is the same as not knowing. Agnes gives them that permission. What about you? Why are you helping? Martha was quiet for a long moment. Because I had a daughter once, Mary. She married young, moved to Colorado with a man who seemed respectable. Letters came regularly at first, then less frequently, then not at all. When I finally traveled there to check on her, I found she'd died 6 months prior. Fell down the stairs, her husband said. Tragic accident. But it wasn't. The neighbors told me things, quiet things, carefully phrased things, about arguments they'd heard, bruises they'd seen, a woman slowly disappearing into fear and isolation while everyone looked away because her husband was respectable and charming, and surely there was some explanation. Martha's voice broke. I didn't save my daughter because I didn't see the signs until it was too late. I won't make that mistake with Mara Hale. Ethan felt the weight of her grief, the burden of guilt she'd carried for years. I'm sorry about Mary. Don't be sorry. Help me make sure Mara doesn't end up like her. Martha straightened, wiping her eyes. Now, Agnes is spreading rumors. You need to decide whether you're going to confront them directly or wait for the marshal to respond to your letter. How long will people listen to me if I try to speak out? In this town? Against Agnes? Martha shook her head. You'll get one chance, maybe. After that, they'll dismiss you as obsessed or inappropriate or crazy. Choose your moment wisely. Ethan spent the rest of the day watching, waiting, thinking. Agnes's campaign against him spread like wildfire through Millbrook Creek's social networks. He could see it in the way people's eyes slid away from his at the general store, in the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the saloon, in the cool distance Martha's other boarders suddenly maintained. By evening, he was effectively quarantined, present in the town but excluded from its community, marked as someone not to be trusted. It was masterful social warfare, and Agnes had executed it in less than 6 hours. That night, Ethan sat in his room composing a second letter, this one to a colleague in Oklahoma City who worked with the Territorial Justice Department. He detailed everything: the suspicious death of James Hale, the deteriorating condition of Mara, the property trust Agnes had concealed, the vial Ruth had stolen, the systematic abuse hidden behind respectability. He ended with a plea: send help, send authority. Send someone who can act before it's too late. He sealed the letter and waited for morning. The next day dawned gray and oppressive, storm clouds building on the horizon like gathering armies. Ethan ate breakfast alone in the boarding house dining room. The other guests had suddenly developed reasons to eat in their rooms or leave early. At 8 o'clock, he rode to the Hale property for the promised meeting about trust documents. Agnes met him at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Cole, I'm afraid I have disappointing news. I've searched extensively, but it seems my late husband's business records were destroyed in a small fire last year. Such a tragedy. I lost several boxes of important documents. The lie was delivered with perfect composure. No records meant no proof of how Agnes had been mismanaging Mara's inheritance. How convenient, Ethan said flatly. Convenient? I assure you it was quite distressing, but accidents happen. Agnes's smile sharpened. I do have the original trust document, of course. Filed with the Territorial Office. Everything is quite legal and proper. Where's Mara? Resting. She's had a difficult few days. All this talk of property and inheritance has upset her delicate constitution. The doctor recommends quiet and isolation until she recovers. What doctor? Dr. Harrison from the next county. He comes monthly to check on her. Agnes's expression radiated false concern. Poor dear has always been frail. These spells come and go. I'd like to see her. I'm afraid that's not possible. As I mentioned, she needs rest. And frankly, Mr. Cole, after your behavior yesterday, filling her head with confusing information, getting her agitated, I think it's best if you limit your contact with her. My behavior? Ethan kept his voice level with effort. I explained legal facts about her own property. You overstepped appropriate boundaries with a vulnerable young woman under my protection. People in town are concerned about your motives. Agnes's tone turned cold. I've been patient, mister. Cole, because I understand you're a stranger here and perhaps don't understand our ways. But I'm telling you now, clearly, stay away from Mara. She's confused enough without you filling her head with ideas above her station. Ideas like the fact that she owns everything you claim is yours? Agnes's mask slipped for just a second, revealing something vicious underneath. Mara owns nothing. She's a child. A simple, sick child who will never be capable of managing anything. The trust ensures I control her inheritance because she's incapable of controlling it herself. That's what her father wanted. That's what's best for her. Her father wanted her protected from you. Her father was a fool who didn't understand what was necessary to survive in this territory. Agnes stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You're playing games you don't understand, Mr. Cole. This is my town. These are my people. Mara is my responsibility, and you are a stranger who will be gone in a few days while I remain. Whatever poison you think you've planted, I'll uproot it the moment you leave. I'm not leaving. Yes, you are. Your business here is concluded. Your room at the boarding house is paid through tomorrow. After that, you'll need to find accommodations elsewhere. Agnes's smile returned, triumphant. And I wouldn't count on anyone in Millbrook Creek offering them. Word travels fast about men who show inappropriate interest in young girls. Ethan felt rage like a physical force in his chest. You're going to kill her. You're going to keep poisoning her, keep breaking her down until there's nothing left. I have no idea what you're talking about. Mara is ill, has always been ill. If she dies, heaven forbid, it will be from natural causes, mourned by a community that saw me devote myself to her care despite her difficult nature. Agnes's eyes were utterly cold. No one will question it. No one will investigate. No one will care. I'll care. You'll be gone, or arrested for harassment, or discovered to have a questionable past that makes your accusations unreliable. Agnes shrugged. I haven't decided yet. But make no mistake, Mr. Cole. If you continue this crusade, I will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that no one will believe a word you say about anything. I've done it before. I can do it again. Before Ethan could respond, a voice spoke from behind Agnes, thin and trembling but audible. No, you can't. They both turned to see Mara standing in the hallway, gripping the wall for support. She looked like death itself, gray-skinned, hollow-eyed, shaking, but there was something new in her expression, something that looked almost like defiance. Mara, Agnes said sharply, I told you to stay in bed. I heard everything. Mara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. Every word. About my property, about the trust, about what my father really wanted. You heard lies told by a stranger trying to manipulate you. I heard the truth for the first time in 6 years. Mara took a shaking step forward. My father left me that property. This house belongs to me. The land belongs to me. You've been stealing from me. Agnes's face transformed into something ugly, the mask finally cracking. You ungrateful little wretch. After everything I've done for you, fed you, clothed you, kept a roof over your head, with my money, the words came out stronger. You used my inheritance to pay for everything, didn't you? And you told everyone you were being charitable, taking in a difficult child, sacrificing for me. You're sick. You don't know what you're saying. I'm sick because you're poisoning me. Mara's hand shook violently, but she didn't back down. I don't know how yet, but I know it's you. The tea. It's in the tea, isn't it? That's why you make me drink it every morning, why you watch to make sure I finish it all. Ethan saw Agnes's face go absolutely still, and he knew Mara was right. That's insane, Agnes said, but her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Calder saw the vial. She took it. Mara swayed but caught herself. She'll have it tested. People will know. It was a bluff. Ruth had hidden the vial, but testing it would take weeks. But Agnes didn't know that. Ethan saw fear flash across her features before she controlled it. No one will believe the Calders. They're poor, desperate. I'll say they're trying to extort me. But Agnes's certainty was fracturing. Maybe they won't believe the Calders, Ethan said, but they'll believe a territorial marshal. They'll believe an official investigation. They'll believe evidence. Agnes whirled on him. There is no evidence. There is no investigation. There's just a sick girl having delusions encouraged by a stranger with suspicious motives. Then explain the vial, Mara said quietly. Explain why you watch me drink every morning. Explain why I get sicker the longer I stay in this house. You're weak. You've always been weak, just like your pathetic father. My father knew. Mara's voice broke, but she continued. That's why he made the trust. He knew what you were. He was trying to protect me from you. Your father was a fool who died knowing he'd failed you. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Agnes realized her mistake instantly, but it was too late. You killed him, Mara whispered. You killed my father. I did what was necessary. James was going to divorce me, throw me out with nothing after I'd devoted myself to him and his brat daughter. The trust was his way of cutting me off. Agnes's composure had completely shattered, words spilling out in her rage. But I'm smarter than he was. I made sure he died before he could change anything else. Made sure you were too weak to cause problems. Made sure everyone saw what I wanted them to see. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was a confession, but there were no witnesses except the three of them. No one else to hear Agnes admit to murder and abuse. Unless he saw movement at the window behind Agnes, a face barely visible through the glass. Tom Calder, with Ruth beside him, both staring in horror at the scene unfolding inside. Agnes hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on Mara, too consumed by her own fury to maintain awareness of her surroundings. You're going to prison, Mara said, and there was a strength in her voice Ethan hadn't heard before. People are going to know what you did. No one will believe you. You're sick, delusional. I'll have you declared incompetent, committed to an asylum. You'll die there, and no one will question it. Agnes moved toward Mara with predatory intent. You should have stayed quiet. Should have stayed grateful. Should have died quietly like you were supposed to. She reached for Mara, and Ethan moved without thinking, stepping between them. Don't touch her. Agnes's hand shot out, striking him across the face with surprising strength. This is my house. She is my responsibility. You have no right. The front door burst open. Sheriff Morrison stood there with Tom and Ruth Calder behind him, all three looking shaken. Sheriff, Agnes said, instantly smoothing her expression back into composure. Thank goodness you're here. This man has been harassing us. He's filled Mara's head with lies, turned her against me. She's having some kind of breakdown. We heard everything, Tom said, his voice rough. Every word. We were outside the window. Heard you admit to killing James. Heard you admit to poisoning Mara. Agnes went white. You're lying. You're all lying. This is a conspiracy. This is over, Agnes, Sheriff Morrison said quietly. He looked sick, like a man who'd just had his world turned inside out. I heard enough through the door. Came with the Calders when they told me something was wrong at your house. You can't arrest me on the word of poor farmers and a stranger. Agnes's voice rose to a shriek. I'm a respected member of this community. I've done nothing wrong. You confessed to murder and attempted murder, the sheriff said, in front of 4 witnesses. They're lying, all of them. Then we'll let the territorial authorities sort it out. Morrison pulled out handcuffs, his hands shaking. Agnes Hale, you're under arrest for the murder of James Hale and the attempted murder of Mara Hale. Agnes fought like a wildcat as Morrison cuffed her, screaming threats and denials. But her power was broken. The mask had been ripped away, and everyone had seen the monster underneath. Mara collapsed against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. Ethan knelt beside her, checking her pulse, rapid and weak. Ruth, get water, he said. Tom, ride for a real doctor. Tell him it's urgent, possible poisoning. As Tom ran for his horse, Ruth brought water with shaking hands. Mara sipped it slowly, her eyes never leaving Agnes being dragged toward the door. It's over, Mara whispered. It's really over. It's over, Ethan confirmed. You're safe now. But as he said it, he saw Agnes twist in Morrison's grip, her eyes finding Mara with pure hatred. This isn't over, she screamed. You think you've won? You're dying, you stupid girl. I've been poisoning you for 6 years. You'll never recover. You'll never be strong enough to claim anything. You'll die knowing I destroyed you. Morrison dragged her outside, her screams fading. Ruth wrapped a blanket around Mara, murmuring soft comfort. And Ethan wondered if Agnes was right. Even with the truth exposed, even with justice coming, would it be too late for Mara? Had 6 years of systematic poisoning done irreversible damage? The doctor arrived an hour later, summoned from the neighboring county by Tom's frantic ride. Doctor Patterson, no relation to Martha, was a competent-looking man in his 50s who examined Mara with thorough professionalism. His expression grew grimmer as the examination continued. Finally, he stood, washing his hands in the basin Ruth provided. She's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of chronic poisoning. Without knowing the specific substance, I can't prescribe a perfect treatment. But we can start with fluids, nutrition, and cleansing agents to help her body purge whatever toxins remain. Will she recover? Ethan asked. Patterson hesitated. I don't know. The damage is extensive. Her organs may have been permanently compromised. Best case, with proper care, she might regain some strength. Worst case, he didn't finish. I want to recover, Mara said from the couch where she lay. Her voice was thin but determined. I want to live. I want to see Agnes face justice. I want to claim what's mine. Then we'll do everything we can to make that happen, Patterson said. But it will be a long, difficult recovery. You'll need constant care, good food, clean water, rest, and most importantly, you'll need to want to fight. I've been fighting for 6 years, Mara said, just to survive. Now I have something to fight for. That's different. Patterson nodded approvingly. Then you have a chance. A good chance. As the doctor left to make arrangements for Mara's care, Ruth sat beside her, holding her hand. You were so brave, Ruth whispered, speaking up like that, standing up to her. I didn't have a choice. I heard what she said to Mr. Cole, and I realized if I stayed silent, she'd win. Even if it killed me, she'd win. Mara's eyes filled with tears, and I couldn't let my father's death mean nothing. He tried to protect me. The least I could do was fight for the protection he gave me. Ethan stepped outside, needing air, needing space to process everything that had happened. The storm that had threatened all morning was finally breaking, fat drops of rain beginning to fall. Tom joined him on the porch. That was close, Tom said. If Ruth and I hadn't been checking on the house, if we hadn't heard through the window. But you were. You did. Ethan looked at the older man. You found your courage when it mattered most. Years too late. But not too late to matter. Tom nodded slowly. What happens now? Now Agnes goes to trial. The territorial marshal will investigate everything. James's death, the poisoning, the embezzlement of trust funds. With 4 witnesses to her confession, she doesn't have a defense. And Mara? Mara gets her life back, her property, her future. Ethan watched the rain increase. Whether she can physically recover enough to enjoy it, that's up to forces beyond our control now. You'll stay? Help her through this? It was the question Ethan had been avoiding asking himself. His work in Millbrook Creek was done. He could leave, let the authorities handle the aftermath, move on to the next assignment. But he'd made a promise to himself. Not this time, not this girl. I'll stay, he said, as long as she needs someone in her corner. Tom gripped his shoulder. Thank you for being brave enough to see what we wouldn't, for caring about a stranger when her own community failed her. Thank Martha, too, and Ruth. You all found your way to doing the right thing eventually. Eventually, Tom repeated, the word heavy with regret. I'll have to live with that eventually for the rest of my life. They stood together in the rain, watching the storm wash over the Hale property, cleansing and brutal in equal measure. Inside, Mara was beginning the long process of reclaiming everything Agnes had stolen. Her health, her property, her voice, her future. Outside, Millbrook Creek was beginning its own reckoning, with the comfortable lies it had told itself, with the willful blindness it had embraced, with the cost of respectable silence. The cage was broken, but the damage it had done would echo for years. The rain continued through the afternoon, turning the roads to mud and washing the summer dust from the air. Inside the Hale farmhouse, Mara's farmhouse, Ethan kept reminding himself, Ruth Calder had taken charge with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd run a household through drought and hardship. She'd stripped the bed where Mara had suffered for years, burning the linens in the stove with a satisfaction that bordered on savage. She'd opened every window despite the rain, letting fresh air chase out the stale atmosphere of fear that had permeated the house. She'd inventoried the kitchen, finding the special tea tin Agnes had kept separate from all the others, marked with a small M that everyone had assumed stood for medicinal. "This is it," Ruth said, holding the tin like it might explode. "This is what she's been giving Mara every morning." Dr. Patterson took it carefully, sniffing the contents. His face darkened. "Arsenic, most likely. Small doses over time. It's a classic method. Symptoms mimic natural illness. Death comes slowly enough to avoid immediate suspicion." He sealed the tin. "I'll send this to the territorial lab for analysis. It'll take weeks, but it'll provide legal proof." "We already have proof," Tom said from the doorway. 4 witnesses heard her confess. Confessions can be recanted. Physical evidence can't. Patterson looked at Mara, who sat wrapped in blankets on the settee, sipping the beef broth Ruth had insisted she take. "How are you feeling?" "Weak, shaky, but clearer than I've felt in months." Mara's voice was still thin, but there was color returning to her cheeks, faint but present. "It's strange. Even knowing how sick I am, just being away from her feels like breathing for the first time. That's the psychological trauma lifting. Your body will take longer." Patterson packed his medical bag. "I'll return tomorrow to check on you. In the meantime, Mrs. Calder seems to have things well in hand." Ruth flushed with pride at the implicit trust. "I'll take good care of her, doctor. On my life, I will." After Patterson left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the house. The adrenaline that had carried them through the confrontation was fading, leaving exhaustion and the enormity of what came next. Ethan found himself watching Mara, searching for signs of the girl she'd been before Agnes, before the years of systematic destruction. He could see hints in the way she held herself now, less hunched, less apologetic about occupying space. But 6 years of abuse didn't evaporate in an afternoon, no matter how dramatic the liberation. "What happens to Agnes now?" Mara asked quietly. "Sheriff Morrison took her to the county jail," Ethan said. "She'll be held there until the territorial marshal arrives to take over the investigation. Given the seriousness of the charges, murder, attempted murder, fraud, embezzlement, she'll likely be transferred to Oklahoma City for trial." "Will I have to testify?" "Almost certainly." Mara's hands tightened on the blanket. "Everyone will know. The whole territory will know what she did to me. What I let her do." "What you survived," Ruth corrected gently. "There's no shame in surviving, child. There's shame in silence, in not fighting back." "You were a child when it started," Ethan said. 13 years old, grieving your father, completely under her control. You didn't choose silence, it was forced on you. I'm not a child anymore. I should have fought, should have run, should have told someone." "Who would you have told?" Tom's voice was rough with guilt. "The town that looked the other way? The sheriff who owed Agnes money? The church that praised her charity?" He shook his head. "We all failed you, Mara. Every adult in this town who saw something wrong and did nothing. That's not on you. That's on us." Tears slipped down Mara's face, the first she'd allowed herself since the confrontation. "I'm so angry. At her, at the town, at my father for dying and leaving me with her, at myself for becoming so small." "Anger is good," Ruth said. "Anger means you're still fighting. Let yourself feel it." "I don't know how. Agnes said anger was sinful, that I should be grateful, humble, accept my lot with grace. Agnes said a lot of things that were lies designed to control you." Ethan moved closer but didn't touch. He'd learned to read Mara's body language, to respect the space she needed. "You get to decide now what you believe, about yourself, about what you deserve, about who you want to be." "I don't know who that is anymore. Agnes spent 6 years telling me I was stupid, lazy, worthless. What if she was right? What if I can't run this property, can't handle my own life?" "Then you'll learn," Ruth said firmly. "The same way everyone learns, by trying, failing, trying again. You're 19 years old, Mara. You have your whole life ahead of you to figure out who you are without her poison in your head." The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it landed. Mara touched her stomach, where the physical poison had done its damage. "Dr. Patterson said I might not fully recover, that my organs might be permanently damaged." "He said you might not. That's different from won't." Tom leaned against the wall, his weathered face kind. I've seen people survive things that should have killed them, seen them build lives from ashes. You've got the same chance they had, a real chance. Don't throw it away by believing Agnes's lies about what you're capable of. Mara looked around the parlor, her parlor, seeing it with new eyes. This is really mine? All of it? Every acre, every building, every asset. Ethan pulled out the trust documents he'd copied from the territorial office. Your father made certain of it. The trust was ironclad. Agnes could manage it, but never own it. At 21, full control transfers to you. But given the circumstances, I suspect the territorial court will grant you immediate emancipation and control. What does that mean exactly? The annual income you mentioned, $800 from leasing land? More or less. Your father leased portions of the property to neighboring farmers for grazing and crops. Those contracts are legally yours. Agnes was collecting the payments and using them as she saw fit, but they belong to you. Mara's eyes widened. $800 a year? It's a modest income by some standards, but it's enough to support yourself comfortably. Enough to hire help for the house and farm. Enough to live independently. Ethan watched understanding dawn on her face. You're not poor, Mara. You never were. Agnes just convinced you that you were dependent on her charity when the reality was exactly the opposite. She was dependent on your money. She stole from me. For 6 years she stole from me. Yes, and the court will require her to make restitution, though whether she has assets to repay you is another question. I don't care about the money. Mara's voice hardened. I care that she made me believe I owed her, that I should be grateful for the scraps she threw me while she was eating meals paid for with my inheritance. The court will care about the money, Tom said. Financial crimes are taken seriously. Add that to murder and attempted murder, and Agnes is looking at life in prison, if not a hanging. The bluntness made Mara flinch, but she didn't look away. Good. She deserves it. For my father, for me, for every moment of suffering she caused. Ruth touched Mara's shoulder gently. You're allowed to want justice. Don't let anyone tell you that forgiveness is required for healing. They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, the rain slowing to a drizzle. Ruth made more broth, insisting Mara drink every drop. Tom checked the property, securing windows and making sure the storm hadn't caused damage. Ethan cataloged the house's contents, documenting everything that legally belonged to Mara in case Agnes tried to claim any of it. It was full dark when Sheriff Morrison returned, looking haggard. Miss Mara, he said, removing his hat. I need to take your statement. Official record of what happened today. Mara straightened, gathering her courage. All right. Morrison sat across from her, pulling out a notebook. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. When did you first suspect Agnes was harming you? It took 2 hours. Mara's voice shook at times, broke at others, but she pushed through. She described the punishments, the cellar, the constant criticism, the way food was withheld or controlled. She described her father's final weeks, how he'd seemed afraid, how he'd told her he'd fix things shortly before his death. She described the morning tea that made her hands shake, the exhaustion that never lifted, the way Agnes watched her drink with those cold, calculating eyes. Morrison wrote it all down, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. Why didn't you come to me? He asked finally. Why didn't you report this? Mara looked at him with something close to pity. Would you have believed me? A girl with delicate nerves accusing a respected widow? When you owed her money and she donated to your re-election campaign? Morrison flushed. I like to think I would have investigated. But you didn't. None of you did. I was dying in plain sight, and the whole town looked away because it was easier than confronting someone you all wanted to believe was good. Mara's voice was steady now, strong, despite her physical weakness. So don't ask me why I didn't come to you. Ask yourself why you never came to me. The silence that followed was crushing. Morrison closed his notebook slowly. You're right, he said quietly. We failed you. I failed you. I saw the signs and told myself it wasn't my business. I accepted Agnes's explanations because they were comfortable. He met Mara's eyes. I can't undo that, but I can promise you that the law will work properly from here on out. Agnes will face every charge, every consequence. No special treatment, no favors. See that she does. Mara's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Morrison left with his head down, carrying the weight of his own complicity. That was harsh, Ruth said after he'd gone. That was honest, Mara corrected. I'm done protecting people's feelings about their own failures. Ethan felt something fierce and proud bloom in his chest. This was the girl Agnes had tried to destroy, the one with backbone, with clarity, with refusal to accept comfortable lies. She was still there, underneath the damage. She just needed time and space to emerge fully. The next morning brought the territorial marshal, a tall, severe man named Garrett, who arrived with 2 deputies and the kind of authority that made Sheriff Morrison look like a child playing dress-up. Garrett interviewed everyone: Mara, Ethan, the Calders, Morrison, Dr. Patterson. He examined the house, the tea tin, the cellar where Mara had been locked for hours at a time. He reviewed the trust documents and the property records. He was thorough, methodical, and utterly unmoved by any consideration except the law. This is one of the clearer cases I've seen, he told Ethan privately. Murder, attempted murder, fraud, embezzlement, child abuse. The confession witnessed by 4 people seals it. Agnes Hale will hang or spend the rest of her life in prison. What about Mara's control of her property? I'll petition the territorial court for immediate emancipation and full ownership rights. Given the circumstances, the abuse, the theft, her age, I can't see any judge denying it. She should have full legal control within a month. And protection? If Agnes has allies, people who might try to intimidate Mara or interfere with her testimony. Garrett's expression hardened. I'm leaving Deputy Marshal stationed in Millbrook Creek until the trial. Anyone who tries to tamper with my witness will face federal charges. Agnes's days of controlling this town are over. The deputy he assigned was a young man named Carson, who took up residence at the boarding house and made his presence conspicuously known around town. The message was clear. Mara was under federal protection now. The old rules no longer applied. The effect on Millbrook Creek was immediate and uncomfortable. People who'd been happy to look away when Agnes was in power suddenly wanted to distance themselves from her. Stories emerged. Whispers about things they'd always suspected, concerns they'd always had, warning signs they'd always noticed. The revisionist history made Ethan sick, but Mara watched it with something like grim satisfaction. They're cowards, she said, watching from the farmhouse porch, as townspeople who'd ignored her suffering for years suddenly gossiped about how they'd known something was wrong all along. Every single one of them. Does it help? Ethan asked. Seeing them scramble to rewrite their own roles? Not really, but it proves I was right about them. They weren't good people who failed to see. They were people who chose not to see because seeing would require courage. Mara's voice was bitter. I'm done giving anyone credit for courage they only found after it was safe. Ruth arrived daily to help with Mara's care, bringing food, company, and the kind of practical support that didn't require Mara to be grateful or gracious. She cleaned the house room by room, helping Mara reclaim each space from Agnes's ghost. Together, they took down the photographs of Agnes, packed away her belongings, transformed the house from Agnes's domain into something that might become Mara's home. The cellar was the hardest. Mara couldn't bring herself to go down there at first, standing at the top of the stairs and shaking while Ruth waited patiently. You don't have to, Ruth said gently. We can just lock it, never use it again. No. Mara's voice was firm despite her fear. I need to see it. Need to prove to myself that it can't hurt me anymore. She descended slowly, Ethan following at a respectful distance in case she needed support. At the bottom, she stood in the packed earth room where she'd spent countless terrified hours, looking at the space with new eyes. It's smaller than I remembered, she said quietly. In my nightmares, it's huge, endless, but it's just a cellar, just a room. It was a weapon Agnes used against you, Ethan said, but it's just a room now. You get to decide what it becomes. Mara was quiet for a long moment, then turned to Ruth. Fill it in. Bring dirt, seal it shut, plant something over it. I never want anyone locked down here again. You're sure? Ruth asked. Completely. This room only existed to cage me. Without that purpose, it has no reason to exist. Tom helped over the next few days, hauling cartload after cartload of dirt and rocks, filling the cellar until it was level with the ground floor. They planted wildflower seeds over the filled space, transforming a prison into a garden. Mara watched the work with fierce satisfaction. Each shovelful of dirt was an erasure of Agnes's power, a reclamation of space that had been used for suffering. "That feels good," she said when it was finished, "making her weapon disappear." "What about the pig trough?" Ethan asked carefully. He'd seen it behind the barn, the rusted iron basin positioned at kneeling height, stained with what he suspected was blood from scraped knees and hands. Mara's face went hard. "Destroy it. Melt it down. I want no trace of it left." Tom took a sledgehammer to the trough that afternoon, battering it to pieces while Mara watched. The sound of metal breaking rang across the property like bells of liberation. When it was done, Tom hauled the fragments to the blacksmith with instructions to melt them into horseshoes, something useful instead of cruel. With each piece of Agnes's architecture of control dismantled, Mara stood straighter. The physical poison was still working its way out of her system, leaving her weak and shaky, but the psychological poison was beginning to lose its grip. She started making decisions about the property, small ones at first. Which crops to plant in the fall? Whether to repair the barn roof before winter? How to approach the farmers leasing her land about their contracts? Ethan helped her understand the business side, but he was careful to advise rather than decide. This was Mara's property, Mara's life, Mara's future. She needed to learn to trust her own judgment. "The Peterson farm has been leasing 20 acres for cattle grazing," Ethan explained one afternoon, maps spread across the kitchen table. "They're paying $30 a year. That's below market rate. You could ask for 45 and it would still be fair." Mara studied the contract, her brow furrowed. Agnes negotiated this? 2 years ago, according to the date. So she was cheating me even on the leases, taking payments that should have been higher and probably pocketing the difference. Mara's jaw tightened. "I want to renegotiate. All of them. Market rates, proper terms, everything in writing and reviewed by someone who knows what they're doing." "That's smart. Do you want me to handle the negotiations?" "No." Mara's voice was firm. "I want to do it. With you there to advise, but I want to be the one talking to them. This is my property. They need to understand that I'm not Agnes, and I'm not going to be pushed around." Pride surged through Ethan. "Then we'll set up meetings. I'll help you prepare, make sure you understand the numbers and your leverage, but you'll do the talking." Over the next week, Mara met with each of her tenants. Some tried to charm her, assuming she'd be easy to manipulate. Others tried intimidation, suggesting a young girl didn't understand business. Mara stood firm through all of it, polite but unyielding, armed with facts and the quiet support of Ethan's presence. By the end, she'd renegotiated every lease to fair market terms, increasing her annual income to nearly $1,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for independence, enough for security, enough to prove she could manage her own affairs. "You did well," Ethan told her after the last meeting. "Better than well. You were brilliant." Mara allowed herself a small smile. "I was terrified. But I kept thinking, what's the worst they could do? Tell Agnes she's in jail, badmouth me in town? They already think I'm difficult and ungrateful. I had nothing to lose by standing up for myself." "You had your self-respect to lose, and you protected it fiercely. Agnes tried to take that from me, made me believe I had no value, no capability, no right to respect." Mara's voice steadied. "But my father must have believed differently. He left me all this because he thought I could handle it. I owe it to him to prove he was right." The territorial court hearing came 3 weeks after Agnes's arrest. Mara had to travel to the county seat, a day's ride that left her exhausted but determined. Ethan accompanied her, along with Deputy Carson for protection and Ruth for moral support. The judge was a hard-faced woman named Matthews who'd been presiding over territorial disputes for 15 years. She reviewed the evidence, heard testimony from Mara, Dr. Patterson, and Marshall Garrett, and rendered her decision without hesitation. The trust established by James Hale was meant to protect his daughter from exploitation. It has manifestly failed in that purpose due to the criminal actions of the trustee. Therefore, I am granting immediate emancipation to Mara Elizabeth Hale and transferring full ownership and control of all trust assets to her, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering a full financial audit to determine the extent of funds misappropriated by Agnes Hale, with restitution to be paid from any assets she possesses. The gavel came down, and just like that, Mara was legally an adult, with full control over her inheritance. She sat very still for a moment, processing. Then quietly, she began to cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally, officially, being free. "It's over," Ruth whispered, holding her hand. "You're really free." "I'm free," Mara repeated, testing the words. "I own my life now." On the ride back to Millbrook Creek, Mara was quiet, staring at the landscape rolling past with new eyes. She owned 160 acres of this territory. She had the legal right to make her own decisions, control her own money, determine her own future. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked. "Everything Agnes said I couldn't," Mara replied. "Run my property, make my own choices, build a life that's mine." She paused. "What about you? You've stayed longer than you planned." "I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't leave until you were safe." "And am I? Safe?" Ethan considered. Agnes was in jail awaiting trial for murder. Mara had legal control of her inheritance, federal protection, and growing physical strength as the poison worked its way out of her system. She had allies now, Ruth and Tom, Martha, even some townspeople who'd found late courage. But safety was relative. The trauma Agnes had inflicted would take years to heal. The town's collective guilt would manifest in complicated ways. And Ethan had seen enough of the world to know that being legally free and being actually safe weren't always the same thing. "You're safer," he said finally. "Whether you're completely safe is something only time will tell." "Then stay a while longer, until we know." Mara met his eyes. "Please, I know I have no right to ask, but—" "You have every right," Ethan interrupted. "And yes, I'll stay." The truth was, he'd already decided. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, Millbrook Creek had stopped being just another assignment and started being something else. Watching Mara transform from Agnes's victim into her own person had rekindled something in Ethan he'd thought he'd lost. The belief that standing up mattered, that one person could make a difference, that courage had consequences worth paying for. He'd failed people before by leaving too soon, by trusting systems that didn't work, by assuming someone else would step in. He wouldn't make that mistake with Mara. 2 months later, Agnes Hale stood trial for murder. The territorial prosecutor brought every charge they could prove. The murder of James Hale by arsenic poisoning, the attempted murder of Mara Hale through the same method, fraud in managing the trust, embezzlement of trust funds, child abuse, and false imprisonment. The trial lasted a week. Mara testified for 6 hours, her voice never wavering as she detailed 6 years of systematic abuse. The T-tin was entered into evidence, lab analysis confirming arsenic levels sufficient to cause chronic illness and eventual death. Dr. Patterson testified about the physical damage Mara had sustained. The Calders testified about what they'd witnessed through the window. Ethan testified about Agnes's confession. Agnes's defense was that Mara was mentally unstable, that the accusations were delusions, that any punishment had been appropriate discipline for a difficult child. But the physical evidence made those claims hollow, and Agnes herself undermined them by her behavior in court. Cold, arrogant, utterly without remorse. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Judge Matthews sentenced Agnes to hang for the murder of James Hale, with the other sentences to run consecutively if the execution was somehow stayed. It was the harshest sentence possible, and Agnes received it without visible emotion. "Do you have anything to say?" Matthews asked. Agnes looked directly at Mara, sitting in the gallery. "You'll never escape what I made you. You'll spend your whole life broken, weak, afraid. I destroyed you, and nothing will ever fix that." Mara stood, her voice ringing clear through the courtroom. "You destroyed 6 years of my life. I have 60 more to prove you wrong." It was the last time they would ever speak. The execution was scheduled for 3 months later, but Mara didn't attend. She had no desire to watch Agnes die, no need for that particular closure. "She's already gone from my life," Mara told Ethan. "Watching her hang won't make her more gone." Instead, on the morning of Agnes's execution, Mara stood on the porch of her farmhouse, and watched the sun rise over land that belonged to her, a future that belonged to her, a life that was finally, completely, her own. The cage was broken, the monster was dead, and Mara Hale was free to become whoever she decided to be. The sunrise that morning painted the Oklahoma sky in shades of amber and rose, colors so vivid they seemed almost defiant. Mara stood on her porch, watching light spill across her land, and for the first time in 6 years she allowed herself to feel something besides survival. Ethan found her there an hour later, still as a statue, her face turned toward the horizon. "It's done," he said quietly. He'd ridden to the county seat at dawn to confirm what they both already knew. Agnes Hale was executed at 7 o'clock this morning. Mara nodded slowly. "I thought I'd feel something, relief maybe, or vindication, but I just feel empty." "That's normal. You've spent so long focused on surviving her, on fighting her, that now that she's gone, there's a space where all that energy used to go." "What do I fill it with?" Ethan moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain the respectful distance Mara still needed. "Whatever you want. That's the point of freedom. You get to choose." They stood together in silence, watching the day strengthen. Behind them, the farmhouse stood clean and bright, every trace of Agnes scrubbed away or buried. The cellar was a garden now, wildflowers blooming where Mara had once been imprisoned. The pig trough had been transformed into horseshoes that some farmer's horse wore without knowing their dark history. Agnes's belongings had been sold or burned, her room converted into a library where Mara kept the books she was teaching herself to read again. Not the Bible Agnes had forced on her, but novels and poetry and agricultural journals. "I've been thinking," Mara said finally, "about what comes next." "And?" "I want to learn everything Agnes said I couldn't. How to manage money properly, how to read contracts, how to run a business. I want to expand the farm, maybe buy cattle, plant crops beyond what the tenants grow. I want to prove that my father was right to trust me with this land." "Those are good goals, ambitious ones. But there's something else." Mara turned to face him, and Ethan saw strength in her expression that would have been unimaginable 4 months ago. "I want to help people. Other people like me. People trapped in situations where everyone looks away." "How?" "I don't know yet exactly, but I keep thinking about how many people in this town knew something was wrong and said nothing. How many times someone could have helped but didn't because it was easier not to see." Her voice intensified. "What if there was a place people could go, or someone they could tell who would actually listen and do something about it?" Ethan felt something stir in his chest, recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who'd survived suffering and chosen to transform it into purpose rather than bitterness. That would require resources, time, energy, connections to people with authority. "I have resources now. My inheritance, once the court finishes calculating what Agnes stole and orders restitution from her estate. I have time. I'm 19 years old. And as for connections," she looked at him directly. "I have you, don't I?" The question hung between them, weighted with more than its surface meaning. Ethan had stayed in Millbrook Creek for 4 months now, well beyond any professional obligation. He'd told himself it was to ensure Mara's safety, to see justice through to completion. But the truth was more complicated. Somewhere in the process of watching Mara reclaim her life, he'd begun to imagine a different future for himself. Not the rootless wandering from assignment to assignment, but something more permanent. Something that mattered beyond the next job, the next town, the next person in need of temporary help. "You have me," he said, "for as long as you want. I want you to stay. Not just for this, but—" Mara's voice wavered slightly. "I know it's selfish. You have your own life, your own work, but I feel safer when you're here. Not because I can't protect myself. I'm learning that I can. But because you see me, the real me. Not the broken thing Agnes tried to make me, and not some fragile victim who needs to be handled carefully. You see who I'm becoming." "I see someone remarkable," Ethan said honestly. "Someone brave enough to transform poison into purpose. And no, it's not selfish to want companionship, support, partnership. Those are human needs." "Partnership," Mara tested the word. "Is that what this is?" "It could be. If you wanted it to be." They'd been dancing around the question for weeks, the nature of what was building between them. It wasn't romance, not exactly. Mara was still too raw from Agnes's abuse to navigate those waters, and Ethan had too much respect for her healing to push for anything she wasn't ready to offer. But it was more than simple friendship, deeper than professional alliance. It was two people who'd found each other at crucial moments. Ethan arriving when Mara needed someone who would see and act. Mara giving Ethan a reason to stop running from his own failures and stand firm for something meaningful. "I'd like that," Mara said quietly. "A partnership. Building something together. Not because I need rescuing, but because I think we could do more together than either of us could alone." "Then that's what we'll do." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching. Ruth and Tom Calder, arriving with the punctuality that had become routine over the past months. They'd appointed themselves Mara's unofficial guardians, checking on her daily, helping with heavy work, providing the kind of steady, uncomplicated support that asked for nothing but offered everything. "Morning," Tom called, climbing down from the wagon. "Brought supplies from town and some news you should hear." They gathered in the kitchen, the heart of the house that Mara had reclaimed and made her own. Ruth unpacked food while Tom settled at the table with the serious expression of a man carrying important information. "Reverend Mitchell made an announcement at service yesterday," Tom said. "He's stepping down from the church." Mara's eyebrows rose. "Why?" "Said he's been doing some soul-searching since the trial. Realized he failed in his duty to protect the vulnerable in his congregation. Failed you specifically." Tom's voice was gruff with approval. "Said he can't in good conscience continue leading a church when he ignored suffering happening right under his nose." "That's surprisingly honest," Ethan observed. "Gets better," Ruth added, joining them. "He's proposing the church establish a fund, money set aside to help people in situations like Mara's, people being abused by family members, people trapped without resources. He's starting it with his own savings, $500. Mara sat back, stunned. "He's giving up his position and his money?" "Says it's the least he can do. That preaching about charity while ignoring actual suffering makes him a hypocrite." Tom met Mara's eyes. "He wants to meet with you, apologize directly, ask if there's anything he can do to make amends." "I don't know what to say to him." "You don't have to say anything," Ruth said gently. "You don't owe him forgiveness or absolution, but it might be worth hearing him out. Not for his sake, for yours. To see that some people can change, can face what they've done, and try to do better." Mara considered this. 6 months ago, she would have been too afraid to confront anyone, too conditioned to accept whatever treatment she received without complaint. But she was different now, stronger, more certain of her own worth. "I'll meet with him," she decided. "But here, on my property. And you all need to be present. I'm done with private conversations where no one witnesses what's said." The meeting happened 3 days later. Reverend Mitchell arrived looking older than his years, his shoulders hunched with the weight of guilt. He accepted coffee from Ruth with shaking hands and sat across from Mara with the demeanor of a man facing judgment. "Miss Mara," he began, his voice rough. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, and none of my words seem adequate. But I owe you the truth, inadequate as it is. I failed you. I saw signs of abuse and chose to interpret them charitably because it was easier than confronting a respected member of my congregation. I let my own comfort and cowardice matter more than your safety. And for that, there is no excuse and no sufficient apology." Mara studied him with the clear-eyed assessment she'd developed, the ability to see people as they were rather than as they presented themselves. Mitchell looked genuinely broken, genuinely remorseful. But remorse didn't undo damage. "You're right," she said finally. "Your apology isn't sufficient. Nothing you say can give me back 6 years of my life. Nothing can erase what I suffered while you looked away." Mitchell flinched but didn't argue. "You're right. I can't undo the past, but I can try to ensure it doesn't happen to someone else. The church fund I'm proposing, it's not enough, but it's a start. Money for people to escape dangerous situations, to hire lawyers, to survive while they build new lives. And I'm resigning my position to someone younger, someone who might have the courage I lacked." "Why now?" Mara asked. "Why not 6 years ago when it might have mattered?" "Because 6 years ago I was more concerned with maintaining peace in my congregation than with actual justice. I told myself that family matters were private, that I shouldn't interfere, that surely Agnes had good reasons for her strict treatment of you. Mitchell's voice cracked. I was a coward, and I convinced myself that cowardice was wisdom. What changed? The trial. Hearing you testify about every moment of suffering while I sat in my church office 50 yards away, available to help and choosing not to see. Realizing that my inaction had consequences, that people died and suffered because I valued propriety over protection. He met her eyes directly. I can't live with that and continue pretending to be a moral authority, so I'm stepping down, establishing the fund, and spending whatever years I have left trying to make amends I know I can never fully make. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. I'll match your $500 from my inheritance to start the fund properly. Mitchell's eyes widened. Miss Mara, you don't need to. I'm not doing it for you, Mara interrupted. I'm doing it for the next person trapped like I was, the next child or woman, or anyone suffering while people look away. If your guilt motivates you to create something useful, then I'll help make it effective. But don't mistake my contribution for forgiveness. You don't get absolution from me. I don't deserve it, Mitchell agreed quietly. But thank you for being bigger than my failures. After he left, Ruth touched Mara's shoulder. That was generous of you. It was practical, Mara corrected. $1,000 can help a lot of people. And if Mitchell wants to spend his remaining years being useful instead of useless, I'm not going to stop him. Forgiveness can wait. Results matter more. Over the following months, the fund took shape. Mitchell recruited Martha Patterson to help administer it. She'd lost her daughter to domestic violence and had the kind of fierce, practical compassion the work required. Together, they established protocols, how people could access funds, what kind of documentation was needed, how to verify claims without requiring victims to prove their suffering to skeptical authorities. The fund helped 3 people in the first 6 months: a young woman escaping an abusive husband, a boy being mistreated by an uncle who'd taken him in after his parents died, an elderly man whose adult son was stealing his pension. Small numbers, but each one represented a life changed, suffering ended, hope renewed. Mara watched the work with satisfaction, but she wanted to do more. Her inheritance from her father, once the court-ordered restitution from Agnes's estate was added, totaled nearly $3,000, a significant sum for a young woman in Oklahoma Territory. She lived modestly, invested carefully, and began to dream bigger. What if we didn't just help people escape? She asked Ethan one evening as they reviewed the farm's accounts. What if we helped them build new lives, provided training, employment, a path forward instead of just a way out? You're talking about a significant undertaking: infrastructure, staff, resources beyond what the fund currently has. I'm talking about using this property. I have 160 acres. I use maybe 20 for my own needs. What if the rest became something useful? A place where people could come to heal, to learn skills, to find their footing before returning to the world. Ethan set down the ledger he'd been reviewing, giving Mara his full attention. You're proposing a refuge, a training farm. I'm proposing a future where people like me don't just survive, they thrive. Where surviving abuse isn't the end of the story, but the beginning. Mara's eyes shone with the fierce certainty that had become her hallmark. Agnes tried to convince me I was worthless, incapable, broken beyond repair. I want to prove her wrong by helping others prove it wrong too. The vision was ambitious, possibly impossible. It would require money, time, expertise Mara didn't yet have. But Ethan had learned not to underestimate what Mara could accomplish when she set her will to something. Then we'll make it happen, he said. We'll start small. Maybe renovate the barn into living quarters. Bring in 1 or 2 people at a time. Build slowly, learn as we go. You'll stay? Help me build this? Ethan had been offered a new assignment 2 weeks ago, surveying work in Colorado that would pay well and take him away from Millbrook Creek for at least 6 months. He'd been avoiding making a decision, knowing what it meant either way. Staying meant giving up the rootless freedom he'd maintained since his own failures had driven him from place to place seeking redemption he never found. It meant planting roots in a town that had shown itself capable of profound moral failure. It meant tying his future to Mara's, to a project that might fail, to a life that was settled rather than transient. But it also meant being part of something meaningful. Being the person he'd always wanted to be, someone who stayed, who built, who stood firm instead of running when things got complicated. I'll stay, he said. Not just to help with the refuge, but because this is where I want to be, where I think I'm meant to be. Mara's smile was genuine, unguarded in a way that still happened rarely enough to be precious. Thank you for everything, for seeing me when no one else would, for staying when you could have left, for helping me become who I am now. You did that yourself. I just held the door open. You did more than that. You gave me hope when I'd forgotten what it felt like. You showed me that not everyone looks away. Mara reached across the table, taking his hand in hers, a gesture of trust that would have been unthinkable months ago. I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if I'm capable of anything beyond friendship after everything Agnes did, but I know I want you in my life, however that looks. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. However it looks is fine with me. We'll figure it out as we go. No rush, no expectations. Just partnership, in whatever form it takes. The refuge took shape slowly over the next year. They renovated the barn first, converting it into simple but comfortable living quarters, with 4 small rooms, a common area, and a kitchen. Tom did most of the construction work, teaching Ethan and Mara carpentry skills as they labored together. Ruth furnished the rooms with donations from townspeople eager to assuage their own guilt through charitable giving. Their first resident was a woman named Sarah, 35 years old, who'd been beaten by her husband for 15 years. She arrived with 2 children, a broken arm and a splint, and the haunted look Mara recognized in her own mirror. You're safe here, Mara told her that first day. No one will hurt you. No one will make you leave before you're ready. This is yours for as long as you need it. Sarah wept with relief so profound it was painful to witness. Over the following months, she healed physically while Mara helped her understand her legal rights, her options, the resources available to her. When Sarah finally left the refuge 6 months later, it was to a new town, a new job, a new life built on foundations of strength rather than fear. You saved my life, Sarah told Mara on her last day. You showed me I was worth saving. You saved yourself, Mara replied. You made the choice to leave, to seek help, to build something new. I just provided the space to make those choices. But Mara knew it was more than space. It was witnessing, being seen, having someone believe your suffering was real and worthy of intervention. It was everything Mara had been denied for 6 years, everything she'd promised herself she'd give to others. The refuge's reputation spread slowly through networks of desperate people. A teenage boy escaping exploitation by the family who'd taken him in as free labor. An elderly woman whose daughter-in-law had isolated her and stolen her savings. A young man fleeing a violent father. They came quietly, referred by whispered recommendations from people who'd heard of a place that actually helped. Not everyone stayed. Some couldn't break free from the familiar patterns of abuse, returning to situations Mara knew would destroy them. Those failures haunted her, reminded her that rescue was only possible for those ready to accept it. You can't save everyone, Ethan told her after one particularly painful departure. A woman who'd returned to her abusive husband after 3 months at the refuge. Some people aren't ready. But she was close. I could see it. Just another few weeks. Maybe. Or maybe going back is part of her journey. Maybe she needs to leave and return several times before it sticks. You can't control that. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. All you can do is keep the door open. Let people know there's a place to come when they're ready. Mara knew he was right, but it didn't make the failures easier. She'd poured so much of herself into helping others, perhaps trying to rescue the girl she'd been by saving others in similar situations. It was meaningful work, important work, but it was also exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated. I need to be careful, she admitted one night after a particularly difficult day, not to make the refuge my entire identity, not to lose myself in other people's trauma the way I almost lost myself in my own. That's wise. What do you need? Balance. Time for myself. Space to just be Mara, not Mara the survivor or Mara the rescuer. Just Mara. They established boundaries after that conversation. The refuge operated according to clear schedules. Mara took time for herself, reading, writing across her property, learning to paint because Agnes had said she had no artistic talent. She let herself be young, be imperfect, be human instead of symbol. And slowly, carefully, she let herself explore the possibility of something more with Ethan. It started with small moments. hands touching as they worked together, conversations that stretched late into the night about dreams and fears and futures. The comfort of his presence, the way she could be silent around him without the silence feeling dangerous. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Mara said one evening, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I'm not sure I know what that means, or how to do it right after everything Agnes did to my understanding of love and trust. But I feel something when I'm with you that isn't fear or obligation, something that feels like choice, like joy." Ethan's smile was gentle, patient, full of understanding. "I've been in love with you for months, watching you transform suffering into strength, watching you choose hope over bitterness, watching you build something meaningful from ashes. But I didn't want to push, didn't want to make you feel like you owed me anything. I don't owe you. That's the point. This isn't obligation or gratitude. It's genuine feeling, genuine choice." Mara moved closer, still tentative but brave. "I want to try. If you're willing to be patient with me while I figure out how to be in a relationship that isn't built on fear and control." "I'm willing to be patient for as long as you need. We'll figure it out together." They built their relationship the same way they'd built the refuge, slowly, carefully, with attention to foundation before structure. Mara learned to trust physical affection again, to separate touch that expressed care from touch that asserted control. She learned that disagreements didn't have to end in punishment, that her opinions mattered, that partnership meant mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. It wasn't always easy. Trauma had carved deep grooves in Mara's psyche, and she sometimes fell into old patterns, apologizing excessively, second-guessing her own judgments, expecting punishment for minor failures. But Ethan was patient, and more importantly, Mara was learning to be patient with herself. "I'm still healing," she told him a year after Agnes's execution. "I might always be healing. That's okay, isn't it?" "That's more than okay. Healing isn't a destination. It's a process. You get to take as long as you need." 2 years after Agnes's death, Millbrook Creek had changed in subtle but significant ways. The refuge had helped 18 people find safety and new beginnings. The church fund Mitchell had started continued operating, now managed by a committee including Martha Patterson and several townspeople who'd found courage after the trial. The town itself had developed a quiet reputation as a place that actually intervened in family violence instead of looking away. It wasn't perfect. Some people still blamed Mara for destroying Agnes's reputation. Some muttered that the trial had been exaggerated, that Agnes hadn't been that bad, that Mara was overly sensitive. But those voices were increasingly isolated, shouted down by people who'd witnessed the evidence and chosen to face uncomfortable truths. Mara turned 21 in August of that year. The trust that had protected her inheritance formally dissolved, transferring full, uncontested ownership of everything to her. She celebrated quietly, a dinner with Ethan, the Calders, Martha, and a few of the people who'd stayed at the refuge and become friends. 21 years old, Ruth said, raising her glass. Owner of a prosperous farm, founder of a refuge that saved lives, and one of the strongest people I've ever known. Your father would be so proud. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. She still thought about her father often, wondered what he'd think of what she'd built, whether he'd approve of her choices, if he could see how she'd transformed the protection he'd tried to give her into protection for others. "I hope he would be," she said quietly. "I hope he knows I didn't let what Agnes did destroy me, that I took what he left me and made it mean something." Later that night, as the celebration wound down, Ethan found Mara on the porch, her favorite spot, where she'd stood so many mornings watching the sun rise on her freedom. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "It's not what you might think, so don't panic." Mara laughed, taking the box. Inside was a key, old iron with an ornate head. "It's the key to my house," Ethan explained. "The one I bought in town last month. I'm giving it to you not as a proposal or expectation, but as a symbol. You have access to my life, my space, my future. Whenever you want it, however you want it. No pressure, no timeline. Just the option. The choice." Mara held the key, feeling the weight of what it represented. Ethan had bought the house without telling her, establishing his own space instead of assuming he'd share hers. He was offering partnership without demanding merger, commitment without requiring surrender of independence. It was the most loving thing anyone had ever done for her. "Thank you," she whispered. For understanding that I need my own space, my own foundation, that love doesn't mean losing myself. You taught me that. You taught me a lot of things about courage and healing and what it means to build something real. Ethan took her hand. I love you, Mara. Not the person you were before Agnes, not the person you might become someday, but exactly who you are right now. And I'm honored to build a life alongside you, whatever shape that life takes. Mara kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It wasn't her first kiss. She'd been carefully exploring physical intimacy for months, but it was the first one that felt completely free of fear, completely full of choice. I love you too, she said, and I want to build a life with you. Not because I need rescue, not because I'm grateful, but because you make me happy. Because being with you feels like freedom instead of cage. They stood together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, making quiet plans for a future that belonged entirely to them. 5 years after Agnes's execution, the refuge had expanded to include a full working farm where residents learned agricultural skills, a small school where children who'd fled dangerous homes could continue their education, and a network of safe houses in neighboring counties. Mara had become a quiet advocate for legal reforms, testifying before territorial legislators about the need for better protections for vulnerable people. She married Ethan in the spring of that year, in a simple ceremony on her property with only their closest friends in attendance. She wore a dress she'd chosen herself, spoke vows she'd written herself, and entered into partnership with complete autonomy and joy. I used to think marriage was a trap, she told the small gathering. Agnes showed me a version of partnership built on control and exploitation, but Ethan showed me something different, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the freedom to be fully myself. That's worth celebrating. Martha cried through the entire ceremony. The Calders beamed with parental pride, and Mara felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Complete, uncomplicated happiness. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. The refuge faced funding difficulties. Some residents brought complicated trauma that Mara couldn't fix. Ethan's past caught up with him when a man he'd failed to help years ago arrived seeking closure. Mara's health, damaged by years of poisoning, sometimes limited her energy. But they faced each challenge together, with the kind of resilient partnership that only comes from choosing each other daily rather than assuming permanent entitlement. 10 years after Agnes's death, Mara stood on her porch, now expanded to wrap around the entire house, and watched children play in the yard. Not her own children, though she and Ethan had decided not to have any, both content to pour their parental energy into the dozens of young people who'd passed through the refuge. These were current residents, 3 children and 2 teenagers, all healing from various traumas, all learning that safety was possible. Ruth Calder, now in her 70s, sat in a rocking chair supervising the play with the fierce protectiveness of a grandmother. Tom had passed 2 years prior, his final words to Mara an apology and a blessing. I'm sorry we didn't save you sooner, but I'm proud of what you've saved. Martha Patterson had retired from running the boarding house, moving to a small cottage on Mara's property where she helped manage the refuge's administrative work. She'd become something like a mother to Mara, filling a role that had been empty since childhood. Ethan emerged from the house with coffee, settling beside Mara with the comfortable ease of long partnership. Thinking deep thoughts? He asked. Thinking about Agnes, Mara admitted. Not with fear or anger anymore, just thinking about how much power I gave her for so long, how she lived in my head even after she was dead, whispering that I was worthless, incapable, broken. And now? Now her voice is barely a whisper. Most days I don't hear it at all. I've built so much that contradicts everything she said about me that her lies have lost their power. Mara smiled. I'm not worthless. I've helped dozens of people build new lives. I'm not incapable. I run a successful farm and a thriving refuge. I'm not broken beyond repair. I'm whole, happy, loved, and loving. You've done more than survive her. You've transformed what she tried to make you into fuel for something beautiful. We transformed it. You, me, the Calders, Martha, everyone who chose to see and act. Mara leaned against him. That's what I want people to understand. That surviving abuse isn't about being heroic or perfect. It's about finding even one person who will stand with you. One person who sees and believes and acts. That can change everything. They sat together as the afternoon light turned golden, watching children play who would have been trapped without intervention, who would have suffered as Mara had suffered if someone hadn't cared enough to create a different option. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked. The life you might have had if Agnes had never happened? If your mother had lived, your father hadn't died? Mara considered the question seriously. I grieve for the girl I was, for the years Agnes stole, for the innocence I lost and the trauma I carry. But regret the life I've built from those ashes? Never. I'm proud of who I've become, proud of what we've created together. Agnes tried to destroy me, and instead she created someone stronger than I might have been without her. That's not gratitude. I still hate what she did. But it's acceptance that suffering doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something meaningful. As the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mara Hale stood on her land, legally hers, spiritually hers, irrevocably hers, and felt the kind of peace that only comes from hard-won freedom. The pig trough was horseshoes now, useful instead of cruel. The cellar was a garden blooming with wildflowers. The house that had been a cage was now a refuge for others seeking safety. And the girl who'd been told she was nothing had become a woman who proved daily that surviving could transform into thriving, that victimhood could evolve into advocacy, that silence could give way to powerful voice. Agnes Hale had tried to write Mara's story as tragedy, but Mara had taken the pen and rewritten the ending as triumph, not because the suffering hadn't been real, not because the scars had fully healed, but because she'd refused to let abuse be the final word. She'd survived. She'd healed. She'd built something beautiful from the ruins Agnes had left behind. And that was the greatest revenge of all, living fully, joyfully, freely, in a life that belonged completely to herself. The cage was broken. The silence was shattered. And Mara Hale stood in the light of her own making, finally, completely, irrevocably free.